Some predators are not satisfied with merely taking a life, they are driven by a dark, psychological compulsion to steal physical fragments of their victims, to eternally preserve their horrifying triumphs. As we examine the absolute darkest corners of these 10 minds, the sheer brutality of the macabre evidence they collected dictates that the most graphic visual remnants of their crimes remain sealed away to align with the boundaries of this platform, leaving only the chilling, unvarnished facts to speak for the dead. If you enjoy investigations, you can subscribe to the channel, and I will try to release interesting investigations as often as possible. In the early years of the 1970s, the coastal enclave of Santa Cruz, California, was celebrated as a tranquil haven characterized by its picturesque boardwalks, its towering redwood forests, and a prevailing countercultural ethos that championed boundless freedom and inherent trust among strangers. This vibrant university town teemed with youth optimism and an overwhelming sense of communal safety that made the practice of hitchhiking not merely a convenient mode of transportation, but an integral, unquestioned aspect of daily collegiate life. Young women, many of whom were students at the recently established University of California, Santa Cruz, or the nearby Cabrillo College, routinely stood along the sun-drenched highways with outstretched thumbs, implicitly trusting the drivers who stopped to offer them a ride. These were brilliant, ambitious individuals deeply embedded in the social fabric of their communities, daughters and sisters who spent their days navigating the rigors of academia and their evenings enjoying the idyllic coastal lifestyle. There was an almost palpable innocence woven into the atmosphere of the era, an assumption that the darkness of the broader world was kept safely at bay by the town's geographical isolation and close-knit collegiate environment. However, this profound societal trust inadvertently created the perfect hunting ground for an apex predator who expertly cloaked his monstrous intentions behind the facade of a gentle, articulate, and exceedingly polite giant. Edmund Kemper, a physically imposing man standing nearly 6 feet 9 inches tall and possessing a genius-level intellect, easily blended into this environment, utilizing his clean-cut appearance and a seemingly harmless demeanor to completely disarm those he encountered. Having been previously institutionalized in his youth for the murder of his paternal grandparents, Kemper had manipulated his way through the psychiatric system, ultimately convincing the state review boards that he was entirely rehabilitated and safe to return to society. His release back into the custody of his overbearing mother in Santa Cruz placed him directly at the epicenter of the precise demographic he had quietly spent years obsessing over and deeply resenting. The community remained blissfully unaware of the immense psychological pressure building within this deeply disturbed individual, an internal storm of misogyny and rage that was steadily pushing him toward a catastrophic breaking point. As the sunny days of early 1972 unfolded, the students of Santa Cruz continued their routines, studying in the libraries and traversing the county roads, entirely oblivious to the fact that their serene coastal paradise was about to be transformed into a grim epicenter of unimaginable violence. The fragile illusion of safety in Santa Cruz was irrevocably shattered in May of 1972, when Fresno State College students Mary Ann Pess and Anita Luchessa vanished without a trace after attempting to hitchhike to Stanford University. What began as a routine journey between academic institutions rapidly devolved into a terrifying mystery as days turned into weeks with absolutely no communication from the two responsible young women. Law enforcement initially treated the situation with the standard procedural skepticism, often operating under the presumption that young adults of the era frequently absconded on impromptu trips without notifying their families. However, the deeply uncharacteristic nature of their prolonged silence, coupled with the frantic pleas of their devastated parents, soon compelled the authorities to acknowledge that a far more sinister scenario had unfolded. The grim reality of their fate remained concealed until a chilling discovery was made months later, when the severed head of Mary Ann Pess was located in a heavily wooded ravine on Loma Prieta Mountain, confirming the community's worst fears. This horrifying discovery served as the definitive point of no return, instantly transforming the previously idyllic perception of Santa Cruz into an atmosphere thick with paranoia, suspicion, and a pervasive, suffocating dread. The realization that a violent predator was actively hunting along the local transit corridors sent shockwaves through the university campuses, prompting law enforcement to issue urgent warnings against the deeply ingrained culture of hitchhiking. Despite these desperate cautionary measures, the sheer volume of transient students and the lack of alternative public transportation meant that many young women remained highly vulnerable to an attacker who possessed an uncanny ability to inspire trust. Kemper had meticulously planned this inciting act of violence, utilizing his vehicle not merely as a mode of transport, but as a mobile, inescapable trap specifically designed to isolate his victims from any possibility of rescue. The sudden shift from a peaceful academic enclave to a recognized hunting ground marked the official commencement of a terrifying epoch in California's criminal history, setting the stage for a prolonged, methodical campaign of terror. The authorities were now undeniably aware that they were facing an exceptionally ruthless and highly organized killer, yet they lacked any substantive leads or forensic evidence pointing toward the remarkably articulate giant who was already plotting his next abduction. Over the subsequent 11 months, the investigation plunged into a desperate and frustrating labyrinth as the killer escalated his activities, systematically abducting and murdering Aiko Q, Cindy Shaw, Rosaline Thorpe, and Alice Liu with chilling precision. The community descended into absolute terror as the body count rose, yet the Santa Cruz police found themselves perpetually outmaneuvered by an adversary who understood forensic countermeasures and investigative protocols better than some of their own detectives. Kemper actively cultivated relationships with local law enforcement by frequenting the jury room, a popular bar situated directly across from the county courthouse, where he would buy drinks for the officers and attentively listen as they openly discussed the frustrating lack of progress in the co-ed killer case. This unprecedented level of access allowed him to constantly monitor the direction of the investigation, ensuring he remained several steps ahead while hiding in plain sight as an eccentric, but seemingly harmless confidant whom the officers affectionately referred to as Big Id. The sheer brutality of the crimes deepened the mystery, as the killer engaged in severe post-mortem mutilations, dismemberment, and necrophilia, actions that baffled behavioral analysts and complicated the physical recovery of the victims. Kemper began a highly disturbing practice of retaining specific body parts as macabre trophies, keeping the severed heads of his victims in his apartment, and sometimes even burying them in the garden, directly facing his mother's bedroom window, as a deeply symbolic act of psychological warfare against her. The retention of these grim mementos was an integral component of his twisted psychological gratification, allowing him to endlessly relive the absolute power and control he exerted during the moments of the murders, long after the victims were deceased. Investigators pursued numerous dead-end theories, frequently profiling the suspect as a socially isolated, disheveled drifter or a known sexual deviant, completely failing to recognize that the monstrous perpetrator was regularly sharing beers with them at their preferred local hangout. The pressure on the police department reached unprecedented heights as the national media descended upon Santa Cruz, broadcasting the grim reality of the unsolved serial killings into living rooms across the entire country. Despite intense surveillance operations, curfews, and massive manhunts, Kemper's meticulous disposal of evidence, combined with his highly calculated selection of isolated locations for his horrific acts, rendered him practically invisible to the intense scrutiny of the local task forces. Every new disappearance added another layer of unbearable tension to the suffocating atmosphere of the town, leading the community to believe that this phantom killer was a supernatural entity, utterly beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement tactics. The peak of this terrifying saga materialized not on a desolate stretch of coastal highway, but within the claustrophobic confines of the duplex Kemper shared with his profoundly critical and domineering mother, Clarnell Strandberg, on the fateful weekend of April 20, 1973, in a brutal culmination of decades of deep-seated psychological torment and festering resentment. Kemper bludgeoned his sleeping mother to death with a claw hammer before decapitating her, executing the very act that psychiatrists later theorized was the ultimate subconscious goal of his entire murderous campaign. In a bizarre and horrifying display of his absolute detachment from human empathy, he subsequently used his mother's severed head as a dartboard and removed her vocal cords, physically silencing the voice that had continuously degraded him throughout his turbulent life. Recognizing that the discovery of her body would inevitably lead the authorities directly to him, he calculatedly invited her closest friend, Sally Hallett, to the residence, strangling her upon arrival to secure sufficient time to orchestrate his escape from the state. Kemper packed heavily armed weapons into his vehicle and embarked on a relentless eastward drive across the country, driving continuously until he reached the town of Pueblo, Colorado, fully expecting the news of the Santa Cruz massacre to dominate the national airwaves. However, to his profound astonishment and mounting frustration, the bodies had not yet been discovered by the California authorities, leaving him stranded in a state of agonizing anticlimax, without the massive, dramatic manhunt he had anticipated. Driven by a complex amalgamation of sheer exhaustion, a desire to seize absolute control over the final narrative, and a realization that the psychological tension had finally evaporated with his mother's death, Kemper walked into a roadside phone booth. He placed a direct to collect call to the Santa Cruz Police Department, calmly informing the bewildered desk officers that he was the highly sought after Ed killer and that the bodies of his mother and her friend were decaying inside his apartment. The local police, intimately familiar with Big Ed as the affable giant from the jury room bar, initially dismissed his confession as a deeply misguided practical joke, repeatedly demanding to speak with his mother to verify the outlandish claims. It required extensive insistence, highly specific details regarding the undisclosed locations of the missing collegiate victims, and a subsequent dispatch of officers to his blood-soaked residence before the sheer, staggering reality of his admission finally breached the disbelief of the authorities. The moment the local police officers arrived at the Pueblo County Jail to take him into custody, the terrifying climax resolved into a surreal confrontation. As the hunters stood face to face with the apex predator, who had been hiding within their own trusted ranks all along, the subsequent trial of Edmund Kemper unfolded as an unprecedented journey into the darkest abysses of the human psyche, marked not by dramatic cross-examinations, but by the defendant's own chillingly articulate and entirely unemotional recounting of his atrocities. Over the course of the legal proceedings, the prosecution presented a mountain of irrefutable, horrifying evidence, including the specific physical trophies he had meticulously collected to prolong the psychological dominance he held over his victims. Kemper waived his right to a jury trial for the guilt phase, openly admitting to the 8 counts of first-degree murder, and instead utilized the courtroom platform to clinically dissect his own profound psychiatric aberrations before a panel of captivated and horrified experts. Despite the defense's intense efforts to secure a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity, the profound level of premeditation, the complex forensic countermeasures, and his own highly lucid testimony completely undermined any legal argument for criminal unawareness. The presiding judge ultimately found Kemper legally sane and fully culpable for his actions, sentencing the towering predator to 8 concurrent terms of life imprisonment, narrowly avoiding the death penalty due to a temporary suspension of capital punishment in California at the time. Incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, Kemper transitioned from a feared serial killer to an incredibly cooperative subject for the FBI's nascent behavioral science unit, providing foundational insights that would heavily shape modern psychological profiling. Today, he remains locked away behind the formidable walls of the high-security prison, a graying relic of a terrifying era, having consistently waived his rights to parole hearings with the explicit acknowledgement that he is entirely unfit to ever walk among civil society again. The families of the victims were left to navigate a permanent landscape of grief, their lives forever fractured by a man who treated their cherished daughters as mere objects to be dismantled and collected for a deeply disturbed personal archive. The Santa Cruz community was permanently altered. The inherent trust and carefree spirit of the hitchhiking era completely eradicated by the stark realization that monsters could perfectly mimic the appearance of a helpful, friendly neighbor. As we close the grim chapter on the Code Killer, we must immediately pivot our focus from the coastal highways of California to the sprawling landscapes of the Pacific Northwest, where another, ostensibly charming intellect was simultaneously weaving an equally devastating web of deceit. A sharply dressed law student with a charismatic smile was about to demonstrate how easily absolute evil can masquerade as the boy next door, utilizing his handsome facade not merely to disarm his prey, but to amass a horrifying collection of physical mementos that would eventually seal his fate. In the mid-1970s, the Pacific Northwest was a region defined by its striking natural beauty, characterized by dense, ancient forests, sprawling mountain ranges, and a vibrant, progressive collegiate atmosphere that fostered a profound sense of community and intellectual exploration. The campuses of the University of Washington and surrounding institutions were teeming with brilliant, ambitious young women who were eagerly embracing the societal shifts of the era, living entirely normal, optimistic lives dedicated to their studies, social causes, and the pursuit of bright futures. This environment of youthful independence and inherent trust inadvertently provided the perfect camouflage for a remarkably deceptive predator who completely defied the traditional, stereotypical profile of a violent, socially maladjusted outcast. Theodore Robert Bundy was, to all outward appearances, an exceptionally charismatic, handsome, and highly articulate law student with a promising political trajectory. Seamlessly navigating the upper echelons of local Republican campaigns and earning the admiration of his peers and mentors, he deliberately cultivated an impeccable public facade, even volunteering his time at a Seattle suicide crisis hotline, where he paradoxically demonstrated a chilling capacity to feign deep empathy while sitting beside the very individuals he would later deceive. This stark, terrifying dichotomy between his perfectly crafted outward persona and the dark, predatory compulsion festering beneath the surface allowed him to effortlessly infiltrate the daily lives of his victims without ever arousing the slightest suspicion from the surrounding community. Utilizing his undeniable charm, clean-cut appearance, and often deploying calculated ruses, such as wearing a fake plaster cast on his arm or leg and struggling to carry books or load items into his distinctively colored Volkswagen Beetle. He brilliantly weaponized human compassion to lure intelligent, cautious women into his deadly traps. The sheer normalcy of his existence in Seattle, his relationships with prominent figures, and his seemingly stable romantic life with a long-term girlfriend served as an impenetrable shield against any initial scrutiny from both his social circle and the authorities. For years, the community remained entirely oblivious to the fact that their trusted friend, colleague, and neighbor was methodically utilizing his intellect and charm not to build a successful legal career, but to orchestrate a highly organized, cross-jurisdictional campaign of abduction and murder. As the region basked in its progressive, peaceful reputation, Bundy was silently refining his predatory techniques, preparing to plunge the Pacific Northwest into an unprecedented era of terror that would forever shatter the illusion that monsters could be easily identified by their appearance or social standing. The serene illusion of safety across Washington state began to fracture irreparably in the early months of 1974, initiated by the highly disturbing and sudden disappearance of Linda Ann Healy, a popular university student and morning radio announcer who vanished directly from her basement bedroom in Seattle, leaving behind only a neatly made bed stained with blood. This initial, chilling vanishing act served as the terrifying catalyst for an escalating crisis, as a steady, methodical sequence of brilliant and vibrant young women, including Donna Manson, Susan Rancourt, and Brenda Ball, began to disappear without a trace from various college campuses and transit corridors across the region. The sheer lack of physical evidence, absence of witnesses, and the seemingly disparate locations of the abductions left local law enforcement utterly bewildered, operating in a frantic state of high alert, but lacking any cohesive threads to connect the rapidly expanding list of missing persons. the absolute turning point of the investigation, the definitive moment that transformed isolated missing persons cases into a highly publicized, collective nightmare, occurred on a sweltering summer day in July at the crowded Lake Sammamish State Park. In an incredibly brazen display of his escalating confidence and predatory compulsion, the killer successfully abducted two separate women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, in broad daylight from a beach teeming with thousands of unsuspecting sunbathers, leaving behind a trail of terrified but observant witnesses. Crucially, multiple individuals recalled interacting with an incredibly handsome, articulate young man wearing his arm in a sling who introduced himself simply as Ted, repeatedly asking for assistance in loading a sailboat onto a metallic brown Volkswagen Bug. The sudden, localized explosion of witness testimonies provided the beleaguered police with their first tangible suspect profile, leading to the rapid dissemination of police sketches and urgent public warnings regarding the charming man in the cast and the distinctive vehicle he drove. However, the resulting influx of thousands of public tips, while indicative of the community's sheer panic, paradoxically overwhelmed the investigative task force, burying highly credible leads beneath a mountain of ultimately useless, generalized information. The realization that a highly organized, mobile predator was operating with such absolute impunity right in their midst shattered the collective psyche of the Pacific Northwest, plunging the entire region into a state of suffocating paranoia, where every stranger was viewed with intense, agonizing suspicion. The authorities had finally attached a name and a face to the phantom terrorizing their streets, but the agonizing reality remained that Ted was already meticulously planning his departure, preparing to transplant his terrifying methodology to a completely new, entirely unprepared jurisdiction. As the heat of the investigation intensified in Washington, Bundy strategically relocated to Salt Lake City, Utah under the guise of attending law school, actively expanding his hunting grounds across state lines and initiating a complex, cross-country evasion that severely tested the limits of fragmented local law enforcement agencies. The sheer geographic span of his crimes proved to be one of his most formidable weapons, as the lack of an integrated national database in the 1970s meant that detectives in Utah and Colorado were initially entirely unaware of the horrifyingly identical patterns of disappearances that had previously devastated the Pacific Northwest. Bundy continued to execute his terrifyingly efficient modus operandi, targeting young women like Melissa Smith and Karen Campbell. But the sheer volume of his crimes inevitably led to critical errors that began to slowly erode his seemingly impenetrable facade. A pivotal crack in his methodology occurred when Carol Duranch bravely fought off an abduction attempt in a mall parking lot, leaving behind her blood and his handcuffs in his vehicle, providing investigators with a surviving witness who could definitively identify the man who had terrified multiple states. Behind the locked doors of his various apartments and rooming houses, Bundy was actively engaging in a deeply disturbing secondary phase of his crimes, transforming from a mere predator into an obsessive collector who required tangible, physical mementos to endlessly sustain his twisted psychological fantasies long after the murders were committed. He meticulously retained highly personal items belonging to his victims, such as distinct articles of clothing and jewelry, but more horrifyingly, he actively engaged in the macabre practice of taking polaroid photographs of their deceased bodies, curating a highly secretive, grim visual archive of his atrocities. In some exceptionally brutal instances, he decapitated his victims and kept their severed heads in his residence for extended periods, applying makeup to their lifeless faces and interacting with them as ultimate tokens of his absolute control over their existence. Despite a growing mountain of circumstantial evidence, traffic stops that revealed highly suspicious burglary tools in his Volkswagen, and mounting pressure from multi-state task forces, Bundy continually managed to manipulate the legal system, firing his seasoned attorneys and utilizing his legal education to actively orchestrate his own defense. His brazen audacity reached unprecedented heights when he successfully executed two separate, highly publicized escapes from county jails in Colorado, exploiting systemic security flaws and utilizing sheer physical agility to vanish into the rugged wilderness and eventually onto a flight bound for the opposite side of the country. This relentless, chaotic progression of events transformed the investigation into a desperate, high-stakes national manhunt, with the FBI and local authorities desperately racing against time to locate an apex predator who had proven incredibly adept at entirely erasing his own footprint while carrying the horrific memories of his victims with him. The devastating climax of this cross-country reign of terror erupted violently in the humid environs of Tallahassee, Florida, where a desperate, severely unhinged, and completely unrestrained Bundy unleashed an unprecedented level of savagery upon the unsuspecting residents of the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. Having entirely abandoned his previously meticulous, highly controlled methods of luring and isolating single victims, he brutally bludgeoned and strangled multiple sleeping women in a chaotic, frenzied attack that left 2 dead and several others suffering catastrophic, life-altering injuries. The sheer, disorganized brutality of the Florida attacks marked the rapid deterioration of his once calculating psychological state, a stark contrast to the highly organized predator who had so carefully navigated the legal and social structures of the Pacific Northwest and the Rocky Mountains. His final, desperate sprint from justice came to an abrupt, unceremonious conclusion in Pensacola, when a remarkably observant local patrol officer noticed him driving a stolen vehicle, resulting in a chaotic physical altercation on a darkened street that finally, permanently neutralized the most heavily hunted man in America. The subsequent trials in Florida evolved into a surreal, highly publicized media circus, broadcast nationally to a captivated audience, featuring Bundy acting as his own defense attorney, arrogantly pacing the courtroom, examining the very officers who had relentlessly pursued him, and fundamentally treating the grim proceedings as a grand theatrical performance. However, his profound narcissism and deep-seated arrogance ultimately blinded him to the overwhelming forensic evidence that would secure his demise. Specifically, the irrefutable forensic odontology analysis of the severe bite marks he had savagely left on the body of Lisa Levy during the Chi Omega massacre. As the undeniable reality of his impending execution finally pierced his delusions of invincibility, Bundy initiated a desperate, highly manipulative campaign to delay his death by offering to trade the precise, long-withheld details of his unsolved crimes in exchange for highly coveted stays of execution. During these intense, 11th-hour interviews with seasoned investigators, the true, horrifying extent of his obsession with trophies was finally revealed, as he casually described revisiting his remote disposal sites, specifically to interact with the decomposing remains, and explicitly detailing the locations where he had scattered the skulls he had previously kept in his apartment. This dramatic, deeply unsettling climax exposed the absolute darkest layers of his psychopathy, stripping away the charming, articulate facade entirely to reveal a deeply broken, fundamentally monstrous individual who viewed human lives strictly as disposable commodities and collectible objects for his personal gratification. The courtroom bravado ultimately collapsed under the sheer, crushing weight of his undeniable atrocities, culminating in multiple death sentences that permanently extinguished his ability to manipulate the narrative or cause further harm to the incredibly resilient communities he had shattered. On the brisk gray morning of January 24, 1989, the incredibly lengthy and agonizingly convoluted legal saga of Theodore Robert Bundy reached its definitive conclusion when he was executed via the electric chair at the Florida State Prison in Stark. Outside the imposing prison walls, massive crowds of demonstrators gathered, cheering and setting off fireworks in a highly visceral, public display of collective relief, a stark testament to the profound, lingering trauma and intense fear he had systematically inflicted upon the nation over the course of more than a decade. Despite his highly publicized last-minute confessions and manipulative attempts to provide supposed closure, he took the precise details and ultimate locations of dozens of suspected, unnamed victims to the grave, leaving countless devastated families suspended in a permanent, agonizing state of unresolved grief. The sprawling investigation fundamentally altered the operational strategies of American law enforcement, catalyzing the urgent development of highly integrated, cross-jurisdictional computerized databases, and profoundly advancing the FBI's utilization of sophisticated psychological profiling to track highly mobile, organized offenders. The horrifying reality of his crimes effectively eradicated the lingering societal innocence of the 1970s, serving as a brutal, unforgettable reminder that the most dangerous predators frequently do not hide in the dark alleys, but rather operate completely in plain sight, entirely masked by conventional attractiveness, advanced education, and a completely fabricated veneer of respectability. The physical trophies he had so meticulously collected and hoarded were either extensively cataloged as critical evidentiary exhibits or entirely destroyed. Yet the sheer psychological damage he inflicted upon the surviving victims, the grieving families, and the collective memory of the affected regions remains permanently indelible. His name became entirely synonymous with a specific breed of intelligent, highly manipulative psychopathy, setting a grim benchmark against which behavioral analysts would measure future offenders who utilized similar tactics of profound deception and calculated charm. As the heavy iron doors finally closed on the horrifying chapter of the charismatic law student who terrorized the Intermountain West, the attention of the investigative world was simultaneously being drawn back to the very same gloomy, rain-swept regions of Washington state that he had initially stalked. There, lurking in the gritty, impoverished margins of the sea, tax strip, an entirely different type of apex predator was quietly, methodically executing a campaign of violence that would vastly eclipse even Bundy's staggering body count, relying not on charm, but on sheer, overwhelming invisibility. It is within these deeply neglected, overlooked corners of the Pacific Northwest that we must now focus our lens, confronting a terrifying enigma who treated the murky depths of the Green River not merely as a disposal site, but as a vast, watery vault for his unimaginable collection of human tragedy. In the early 1980s, the sprawling, neon-lit corridors of the Pacific Highway South, commonly known as the Sea Tax Strip, presented a stark and unforgiving contrast to the lush, emerald landscapes that typically define Washington state. This gritty, transient stretch of road situated just outside of Seattle was a chaotic nexus of cheap motels, flickering dive bars, and truck stops, serving as a bleak haven for individuals pushed to the absolute margins of a rapidly modernizing society. The young women who navigated this perilous environment were frequently runaways, struggling mothers, or teenagers trapped in the devastating cycles of poverty, addiction, and systemic neglect, desperately trying to survive in a world that had largely turned its back on them. Their daily existence was characterized by profound vulnerability, forced to engage in high-risk sex work merely to secure basic necessities, making them virtually invisible to the broader, affluent communities residing just a few miles away. Law enforcement presence in these specific zones was often minimal or strictly punitive, creating a deep-seated distrust between the marginalized women and the authorities who were theoretically sworn to protect them from harm. This fractured relationship inadvertently cultivated an ideal, unsupervised hunting ground for a predator who deeply understood the societal apathy surrounding sex workers and recognized that their sudden absences would likely go completely unreported for weeks, if not months. Unlike the charismatic killers who utilized charm to lure their prey from universities or pristine parks, this particular threat blended seamlessly into the dilapidated background, driving an unremarkable truck and offering a few dollars for a momentary transaction in the shadows. He was a terrifyingly ordinary figure, a quiet painter working at a local truck plant, whose remarkably dull exterior perfectly masked a raging, pathological hatred directed specifically at the women of the Strip. As the humid summers of the early 1980s descended upon King County, the vulnerable populations of the Pacific Highway continued their dangerous nightly routines, entirely unaware that a methodical, exceptionally prolific serial killer was quietly embedding himself into their transient world. The stage was tragically set for a campaign of unprecedented violence, as the region's profound societal failures provided an uninterrupted supply of forgotten victims for a man who would soon become one of the most prolific murderers in American history. The crushing reality of this silent massacre brutally breached the public consciousness in the late summer of 1982, when the murky, sluggish waters of the Green River surrendered the first terrifying pieces of a rapidly expanding puzzle. Two young boys, navigating the overgrown banks of the river in search of discarded items, stumbled upon the decomposing remains of 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield tangled in the submerged branches, instantly shattering the localized apathy regarding the missing women of the Strip. Within a matter of days, the river yielded even more horrifying secrets, as authorities combing the immediate vicinity discovered the bodies of Deborah Lynn Bonner, Marcia Chapman, Cynthia Hines, and Opal Mills, all clustered in a sickeningly deliberate disposal site. This concentrated, horrifying discovery served as the definitive inciting incident that officially established the existence of the Green River Killer, transforming a series of vaguely connected missing persons reports into an active, unprecedented mass murder investigation. The sheer geographic concentration of the victims in the cold waters indicated not only a profound level of arrogance on the part of the killer, but also a deeply ritualistic approach to body disposal, treating the natural landscape as a personal, watery graveyard. Panic rapidly infected the Pacific Northwest as the local media broadcast the grim details of the river recoveries, forcing the surrounding communities to abruptly confront the staggering magnitude of the violence that had been silently occurring right on their doorstep. The King County Sheriff's Office, previously criticized for their slow response to the disappearances of marginalized women, suddenly found themselves thrust into the center of an overwhelming, chaotic crisis that demanded immediate answers they simply did not possess. The establishment of this macabre cluster site served as a glaring, undeniable declaration of war from a phantom predator who was operating with a terrifyingly efficient methodology, leaving virtually no trace evidence behind in the waterlogged terrain. As investigators frantically cordoned off the riverbanks, they were forced to acknowledge the grim reality that they were not merely dealing with a localized threat, but a highly mobile, incredibly disciplined adversary who had already amassed a staggering body count before the authorities even realized a hunt was underway. The region was thrust into an era of profound paranoia, knowing that the killer responsible for dumping these young women into the river was still driving the same streets, actively searching for his next target. As the terrifying death toll continued to climb exponentially throughout the 1980s, the newly formed Green River Task Force found themselves entirely engulfed in an investigative quagmire that would ultimately span more than 2 agonizing decades. The task force, operating out of a cramped, heavily guarded command center, amassed mountains of case files, meticulously logging thousands of tips and conducting desperate sweeps of the dense forests and ravines surrounding Seattle. Despite their monumental efforts, the killer demonstrated a chilling ability to adapt, abandoning the river and shifting his disposal methods to deeply secluded, heavily wooded cluster sites scattered across multiple counties, severely complicating the recovery of remains. Investigators soon recognized a profoundly disturbing behavioral signature at these remote scenes. The killer was systematically stripping his victims of their clothing and actively hoarding their personal jewelry as morbid trophies of his conquests. Furthermore, he exhibited a highly bizarre, ritualistic compulsion to contaminate his crime scenes by leaving foreign objects, such as discarded cigarette butts or chewed gum, completely unrelated to the victims, intentionally placed to deliberately mislead forensic technicians. The sheer volume of suspects interviewed by the task force was staggering, pulling in thousands of local men, including an incredibly quiet, cooperative commercial truck painter named Gary Leon Ridway, who was briefly questioned in 1983 and 1984 but lacked the overt, menacing profile the police were anticipating. Ridway remarkably passed a polygraph examination and seamlessly melted back into the background, continuing his deadly routine while investigators chased promising but ultimately disastrously incorrect leads, heavily profiling aggressive pimps and local taxi drivers. The intense pressure to solve the case led to unprecedented measures, including detectives formally consulting an incarcerated Ted Bundy, who accurately predicted that the killer was frequently revisiting his disposal sites to engage in necrophilia, a gruesome reality that investigators later confirmed. Decades slipped by with the investigation effectively frozen, the files growing thick with dust as the original detectives retired and the devastated families of the victims resigned themselves to the terrifying probability that the Green River Killer would never be unmasked. Yet, the physical evidence, meticulously preserved in deeply refrigerated evidence lockers, silently awaited the arrival of a technological revolution that would finally expose the devastating truth hidden within the microscopic remnants left behind by the elusive phantom. The agonizing multi-decade paralysis of the Green River investigation was suddenly and dramatically shattered in 2001, catalyzed by a monumental leap in the scientific capabilities of forensic DNA analysis that breathed unexpected life into the coldest of cases. A deeply determined cold case detective, refusing to abandon the forgotten women of the Strip, submitted a carefully preserved semen sample extracted from the remains of early victims Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, and Carol Ann Christensen to the recently advanced Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory. The laboratory utilized cutting, edge short tandem repeat, cysteine DNA profiling, a sophisticated technique completely unavailable during the initial phase of the murders, to finally extract a clear, undeniable genetic blueprint of the phantom who had terrorized the region. This pristine genetic sequence was subsequently run against an archived saliva swab that had been discreetly collected from Gary Ridgway back in 1987, when he was merely a peripheral person of interest. A sample that had sat dormant in police custody for 14 years. The resulting match was an absolute, statistical certainty, a microscopic revelation that instantaneously connected the unremarkable aging truck painter to the horrific cluster of bodies discovered near the Green River nearly 2 decades prior. The climax of this sprawling saga materialized not in a dramatic shootout or a high-speed pursuit, but in the meticulously planned, utterly quiet arrest of Ridgway as he was leaving his mundane shift at the Kenworth truck plant on November 30, 2001. As the deeply bewildered, gray-haired man was securely handcuffed and placed into the back of an unmarked police cruiser. The sheer cognitive dissonance of the moment struck the arresting officers. The monster responsible for an unprecedented era of terror looked entirely harmless, resembling a mild-mannered grandfather rather than a ruthless apex predator. Inside the sterile confines of the interrogation room, Ridgway's carefully maintained facade of bewildered innocence rapidly dissolved when confronted with the irrefutable, deeply specific DNA evidence that definitively placed him in intimate contact with the murdered women. The towering wall of undeniable scientific proof completely broke his resolve, resulting in a shocking cascade of admissions where he coldly, methodically detailed the sheer scale of his atrocities, revealing a body count so massive it deeply horrified even the most hardened veterans of the task force. His arrest concluded the longest and most expensive serial murder investigation in American history, dragging the monster out from the dark corners of the Pacific Highway and thrusting him directly into the unforgiving light of justice, in a deeply controversial but profoundly necessary maneuver to secure ultimate closure. The King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office orchestrated an unprecedented plea agreement in 2003, removing the threat of the death penalty in exchange for Ridgway's absolute, comprehensive cooperation in locating the remains of dozens of still missing women. Over the course of several harrowing months, Ridgway led heavily armed task force members through the dense, overgrown brush of the Pacific Northwest, casually pointing out the long-forgotten, hidden ravines where he had discarded human lives, as if recalling the locations of misplaced tools. This grim, deeply unsettling process ultimately resulted in Ridgway pleading guilty to an astonishing 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder, a record-breaking conviction that cemented his status as the most prolific confirmed serial killer in the history of the United States. During his sentencing hearing, he stood entirely impassive before the shattered families of his victims, receiving 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the remainder of his days would be spent in the absolute, total isolation of the Washington State Penitentiary. While the plea deal successfully recovered numerous remains and finally provided definitive answers to mothers and fathers who had waited decades in agonizing uncertainty, It simultaneously left the bitter realization that this exceptionally unremarkable man had effortlessly outsmarted the system for an entire generation. The jewelry and keepsakes he had methodically collected and stored in his unassuming suburban home were systematically cataloged, serving as chilling, physical testaments to his deep-seated desire to retain a permanent, triumphant connection to the marginalized women he had so easily erased from existence. Ridgway's horrific legacy permanently forced society to confront the devastating, lethal consequences of systemic apathy toward vulnerable populations, proving that a killer's greatest weapon is often the societal invisibility of his chosen targets. The case fundamentally altered the protocols for missing persons cases involving sex workers, ensuring that future disappearances from the margins of society would trigger an immediate, robust law enforcement response rather than dismissive skepticism. As we leave the perpetually gloomy, damp forests of Washington state and the unparalleled body count of the Green River Killer behind, we must turn our investigative focus eastward toward the industrial landscapes of upstate New York. There, the city of Rochester was about to experience a terrifying resurgence of violence at the hands of a paroled killer, an individual who not only returned to his murderous ways with terrifying ease, but escalated his absolute depravity by keeping deeply disturbing, physical pieces of his victims as he stalked the banks of the Genesee River. In the late 1980s, the industrial city of Rochester, New York, stood as a resilient, hardworking community defined by its sprawling manufacturing sectors, historic architecture, and the steady, powerful flow of the Genesee River cutting directly through its urban center. The citizens of this upstate metropolis went about their daily routines with a general sense of blue-collar pragmatism, completely trusting in the municipal and state systems designed to maintain order and keep known, deeply dangerous threats safely isolated behind prison walls. However, a profound, catastrophic failure within the state's parole board and psychiatric evaluation systems had recently allowed an incredibly lethal, unrepentant predator to quietly slip back into society under a veil of absolute, bureaucratic secrecy. Arthur Shawcross, a man who had previously been convicted and imprisoned for the horrific, unspeakable murders of two young children in a completely different upstate town over a decade prior, was inexplicably deemed safe for public reintegration and subsequently relocated to a deeply unassuming neighborhood in Rochester. Operating under a carefully constructed, utterly mundane facade, Shawcross secured a job as a food service worker and presented himself to his new neighbors as an ordinary, albeit slightly eccentric, middle-aged man who harbored a mild interest in fishing and quiet, solitary activities. The broader community, and more importantly, the deeply vulnerable, marginalized women who frequently navigated the city's red, light districts for survival, remained entirely oblivious to the terrifying reality that a documented, profoundly disturbed murderer was now walking freely among them. This staggering lack of public awareness, coupled with the absolute anonymity afforded by his seemingly unremarkable daily routine, provided Shawcross with the perfect, unimpeded opportunity to seamlessly resume the violent, pathological compulsions that had never truly been eradicated during his long incarceration. He utilized his extensive, completely unmonitored freedom to carefully scout the desolate, heavily wooded perimeters of the city and the isolated gorges of the Genesee River, methodically transforming these natural landscapes into deeply hidden, future depositories for his impending atrocities. The tragic, unavoidable collision between a trusting public and an irredeemably broken mind was silently accelerating, entirely obscured by the bureaucratic silence that had essentially handed a proven monster the keys to a fresh, unsuspecting hunting ground. As the harsh, freezing winter of early 1988 slowly began to thaw across the industrial skyline, the streets of Rochester continued their normal, bustling rhythms, fundamentally unaware that the foundational trust they placed in the justice system was about to result in an era of unprecedented, grotesque violence. The fragile, completely fabricated peace hovering over Rochester was brutally and irrevocably shattered in March of 1988 when the mysterious, highly alarming disappearances of local women began to transition into a series of deeply horrific, tangible discoveries scattered across the rural outskirts. The inciting incident that forced local law enforcement to violently awaken to the presence of a localized, highly active predator occurred when the decomposing remains of a young woman were located in a remote, deeply wooded area, bearing unmistakable, chilling signs of a highly methodical and vicious attack. This initial, grim recovery instantly dismantled the prevailing, comfortably dismissive theories that the missing women, many of whom struggled with deep-seated addiction and engaged in survival sex work, had simply migrated to other cities or voluntarily severed ties with their estranged families. As investigators meticulously combed the unforgiving, icy terrain for any microscopic fragments of forensic evidence, the dawning realization that a deeply disturbed serial killer was actively utilizing the city's natural geography as a sprawling, personal graveyard sent an immediate, paralyzing shockwave through the highest levels of the police department. The sheer, terrifying brutality inflicted upon the body indicated that this was not the work of an amateur or a panicked assailant, but rather the calculated, cold-blooded execution of a predator who possessed an incredibly dark, deeply entrenched familiarity with extreme, systematic violence. The immediate, frantic establishment of a dedicated task force marked the absolute point of no return for the city, instantaneously transforming the previously ignored, marginalized corridors of the Lyell Avenue district into the focal point of a desperate, high-stakes hunt for an invisible phantom. As the local news stations began broadcasting the terrifying reality of the localized discoveries, a thick, suffocating blanket of fear and severe paranoia rapidly enveloped the community, deeply altering the nightly behaviors of the citizens who suddenly realized that the darkness held an active, lethal threat. The investigators, operating under immense, crushing pressure from a terrified public and a highly critical media establishment, found themselves staring into a vast investigative void, possessing a rapidly increasing list of missing persons, but severely lacking any cohesive, actionable leads pointing toward the killer's actual identity. The discovery fundamentally changed the investigative landscape of Monroe County, proving definitively that a predator was not only operating with absolute, terrifying impunity but was also actively escalating his horrific methodology with each subsequent, brutal abduction. It became undeniably apparent that the elusive monster haunting the Rochester streets was entirely unfazed by the sudden, massive influx of police scrutiny, silently preparing to plunge the city into a prolonged, deeply grotesque nightmare that would strictly challenge the very boundaries of forensic science and investigative endurance. Over the agonizing, relentless span of the next 20 months, the investigation morphed into a sprawling, deeply frustrating battle of attrition as the elusive killer's body count rapidly soared to an astonishing 11 victims, leaving the heavily burdened Rochester Police Department grasping at elusive shadows. Shawcross continued his horrific, highly organized campaign with a chilling level of discipline, continuously targeting the highly vulnerable, deeply marginalized women of the city and driving them to profoundly isolated, heavily overgrown areas along the Genesee River and the Erie Canal. The sheer, overwhelming depravity of the crime scenes deeply horrified even the most seasoned, hardened homicide detectives, as they continuously uncovered evidence of severe, post-mortem mutilations and increasingly grotesque acts that pointed toward a profoundly disordered, highly sadistic psychological state. It became glaringly obvious to the behavioral analysts embedded within the task force that the perpetrator was not merely killing to eliminate witnesses, but was actively, methodically collecting highly specific, deeply personal trophies, frequently stripping his victims of all their clothing and retaining their garments as physical anchors to his brutal conquests. This macabre, highly obsessive retention of clothing, identification cards, and cheap jewelry was a vital component of his psychological gratification, allowing him to continuously relive the absolute, terrifying power he exerted over the women long after their broken bodies had been discarded in the freezing mud. As the investigative desperation reached unprecedented heights, the task force aggressively deployed advanced geographical profiling techniques, meticulously mapping the sprawling, interconnected cluster sites in a frantic attempt to predict the precise, logical boundaries of the killer's heavily guarded comfort zone. The police flooded the known hunting grounds with undercover officers and initiated massive, highly coordinated surveillance sweeps. Yet Shawcross continuously managed to slip through the extensive, sophisticated dragnets by utilizing his incredibly unremarkable appearance and his intimate, deeply ingrained knowledge of the city's hidden peripheral backroads, false leads, deeply misguided tips, and a constant influx of meaning but utterly useless information continuously bogged down the administrative side of the investigation, forcing detectives to waste countless, invaluable hours chasing phantoms, while the real monster calmly ate his dinner just a few miles away. The psychological toll on the task force members was immeasurable, as they were repeatedly forced to witness the devastating, horrific aftermath of the killer's escalating madness, including deeply disturbing forensic evidence that strongly suggested the perpetrator was engaging in acts of extreme, unmentionable defilement before permanently abandoning the remote scenes. The entire region was effectively held hostage by a completely faceless, highly organized terror, an entity who seemed perfectly capable of striking at will and vanishing back into the suffocating upstate fog, leaving behind absolutely nothing but a devastating trail of shattered families and stolen, deeply personal mementos. The agonizing, seemingly insurmountable deadlock of the Genesee River investigation finally shattered in a moment of sheer, high-altitude brilliance during the freezing, deeply suspenseful days of early January in 1990, recognizing the serial killer's highly documented, profoundly disturbing psychological compulsion to physically return to his disposal sites to interact with the decomposing remains. Law enforcement implemented a massive, highly secretive aerial surveillance operation over the known, heavily targeted geographical zones. The absolute, breathtaking climax of this exhaustive manhunt unfolded when a meticulously positioned police helicopter, silently hovering high above the desolate, ice-choked expanse of the river gorge, spotted a solitary, highly suspicious vehicle parked on a remote, isolated bridge directly above a recently discovered, deeply hidden victim. The aerial spotters immediately directed heavily armed ground units to the precise, secluded location, intercepting the entirely unsuspecting Arthur Shawcross, just as he was casually lingering near the frozen, heavily wooded precipice where he had recently discarded the lifeless body of June Cicero, in a desperately calculated, highly unconvincing attempt to explain his incredibly suspicious presence in the desolate, restricted area. Shawcross weakly claimed to the approaching officers that he had merely stopped his vehicle to urinate and innocently enjoy the stark, wintry scenery. Although the initial patrol officers momentarily allowed him to leave the immediate, tightly controlled scene due to a lack of immediate, overwhelming probable cause to make a physical arrest, they meticulously recorded his identity and distinct vehicle information, instantaneously connecting the deeply unremarkable man to the sprawling, high-priority suspect matrix. Within a matter of hours, heavily armed task force detectives descended upon his residence, bringing the thoroughly bewildered and previously invisible monster into the sterile, highly intimidating confines of the police interrogation rooms for a brutally intense, high-stakes confrontation. Stripped of his carefully maintained, thoroughly mundane disguise, Shawcross rapidly crumbled under the crushing, undeniable weight of the geographical evidence and the incredibly specific, highly aggressive questioning executed by the deeply exhausted, entirely unforgiving homicide detectives. The horrifying, completely unvarnished truth poured out of him in a staggering, hours-long confession, during which he coldly and clinically detailed the precise, devastating locations of his remaining victims, fundamentally confirming the worst, most deeply suppressed fears of the entire community. This dramatic, highly anticipated capture completely eradicated the suffocating, pervasive terror that had gripped Rochester, finally neutralizing a profoundly deranged killer who was caught not by complex forensic magic, but by his own deeply twisted, undeniable need to revisit the morbid trophies he had left rotting in the snow. The subsequent, highly publicized trial of Arthur Shawcross rapidly devolved into a deeply disturbing, profoundly complex legal battle centered entirely around the highly contentious, strictly analyzed state of his deeply fractured psychological well-being, desperately attempting to evade the ultimate, crushing weight of a permanent prison sentence. The defense team mounted a highly controversial, incredibly aggressive psychiatric strategy, arguing that Shawcross was completely driven by severe, undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from his military service in Vietnam, compounded by deeply rooted, irreversible brain damage. Shawcross himself took the stand to deliver deeply horrific, completely bizarre testimonies, making incredibly grandiose, entirely unverified claims of engaging in extensive cannibalism and participating in unspeakable wartime atrocities, attempting to paint himself as an uncontrollable, deeply damaged product of systemic governmental failure. However, the deeply methodical, highly experienced prosecution systematically dismantled this elaborate, highly theatrical psychiatric defense, presenting an overwhelming, completely undeniable mountain of physical evidence, including the specific, horrifyingly personal clothing items he had so meticulously stolen and kept as intimate trophies from the helpless victims. The prosecution successfully and definitively proved that his actions were not the chaotic, unguided thrashings of a legally insane mind, but rather the highly calculated, deeply premeditated executions of a seasoned predator who perfectly understood the inherent criminality of his deeply grotesque compulsions. The highly attentive jury, utterly unconvinced by the incredibly manipulative, deeply contradictory psychological excuses, quickly returned a resounding, absolute verdict of guilty on numerous counts of second-degree murder, completely ensuring that the bureaucratic, catastrophic failure that initially led to his release would never be repeated. Shawcross was immediately sentenced to an effective, permanent term of 50 years in maximum security, where he languished in complete, total obscurity until his eventual, entirely unceremonious death from cardiac arrest behind bars in the late months of 2008. The Rochester community was left to undergo a massive, deeply painful process of collective healing, permanently scarred by the brutal, unforgettable realization that a previously convicted monster had been allowed to so easily, completely systematically decimate their most deeply vulnerable populations. His horrific, deeply twisted legacy serves as a permanent, incredibly grim testament to the catastrophic, fatal consequences of systemic oversight, demonstrating precisely what happens when an apex predator is blindly handed the absolute freedom to hoard human lives like entirely disposable, deeply tragic keepsakes. As we pivot our investigative lens away from the freezing, heavily shadowed gorges of upstate New York, we must plunge directly into the overwhelming, chaotic neon frenzy of the late 1970s Times Square, where another profoundly vicious, entirely merciless killer was utilizing the overwhelming anonymity of New Jersey motels to build an entirely different, incredibly gruesome collection of horrifying trophies. In the chaotic twilight of the late 1970s, the infamous stretch of Times Square and its surrounding avenues in New York City functioned as a pulsating, lawless epicenter of illicit trade, completely far removed from the sanitized tourist destination it would eventually become. This towering concrete jungle of flashing neon marquees, adult theaters, and transient hotels provided an unprecedented layer of absolute anonymity for hundreds of marginalized individuals who desperately navigated the dangerous underground economy of sex work to survive the crushing economic realities of the era. The sheer volume of transient populations crossing between the bustling thoroughfares of Manhattan and the quiet, unassuming motel strips bordering the highways of neighboring New Jersey created a massive, highly disjointed jurisdictional labyrinth that severely handicapped coordinated law enforcement efforts. Within this sprawling, indifferent urban ecosystem, a terrifyingly ordinary-looking computer operator and married father of 3 named Richard Cottingham systematically utilized the pervasive societal apathy as a perfect, impenetrable cloak for his unimaginably violent compulsions. To his colleagues at the Blue Cross Blue Shield offices and his unsuspecting family in the quiet suburbs of New Jersey, Cottingham presented the impeccable facade of an incredibly stable, exceptionally reliable provider who dutifully commuted into the city every single day. However, beneath this carefully constructed, thoroughly mundane exterior lurked an utterly merciless, highly organized predator who secretly maintained a separate, clandestine apartment strictly dedicated to his dark obsessions and the meticulous storage of his horrifying conquests. He exploited his seemingly harmless demeanor, his steady income, and his profound knowledge of the interconnected transit routes to seamlessly lure young, highly vulnerable women from the neon-lit chaos of 42nd Street directly into the sterile, isolating environments of budget motel rooms. These women, accustomed to the inherent, everyday dangers of their profession, were fatally disarmed by his unassuming, white-collar appearance, never suspecting that the quiet man offering them cash was actually a highly experienced, deeply sadistic monster preparing to extinguish their lives. The authorities on both sides of the Hudson River remained entirely oblivious to the fact that a cross-jurisdictional serial killer was actively establishing a terrifying, ritualistic hunting pattern perfectly poised to exploit the profound communication gaps between major metropolitan police departments. As the decade drew to a close, the frantic, unchecked energy of the Times Square district was about to collide violently with one of the most prolific and profoundly brutal serial killers in American history. The stage was tragically set for a localized reign of absolute terror that would permanently scar the region and redefine the parameters of modern serial homicide investigations. The grim, horrifying reality of this entirely unrestrained predator viciously breached the public consciousness on the chilling morning of December 2, 1979, when an unimaginable scene of absolute carnage was discovered inside a burning room at the Travel Inn Motor Hotel, situated near the heart of Times Square. Responding firefighters, initially expecting a routine, easily contained structural fire, violently breached the heavily locked door only to be confronted by a terrifying, gruesome tableau that immediately elevated the incident from a standard arson investigation into a massive, unprecedented homicide crisis. Lying on the blood-soaked beds were the severely mutilated, decapitated remains of 22-year-old Dita Gudarzi and a second, severely traumatized victim who would tragically remain a completely unidentified Jane Doe for several agonizing decades. In a deeply calculated, forensic countermeasure designed specifically to obliterate any possibility of swift identification, the killer had meticulously removed both the heads and the hands of the victims, taking these severed body parts with him into the sprawling, indifferent metropolis. Furthermore, the perpetrator had strategically utilized highly flammable lighter fluid to intentionally set the hotel room ablaze, a desperate, systematic attempt to permanently destroy all biological evidence and drastically complicate the ensuing forensic analysis conducted by the deeply overwhelmed New York Police Department. This horrific, incredibly brutal discovery served as the definitive, undeniable inciting incident that officially confirmed the presence of a highly organized, completely ruthless serial killer who possessed an exceptionally dark, advanced understanding of criminal evasion and post-mortem dismemberment. The sheer, unprecedented savagery of the Travel Inn murders instantaneously sent a massive, paralyzing shockwave of terror rippling through the closely knit, marginalized communities of the city's red light districts, as the terrifying realization dawned that an apex predator was hunting with absolute impunity. Homicide detectives were immediately thrust into a desperate, intensely pressurized investigation, completely lacking any tangible physical descriptions, viable surveillance footage, or immediate motives beyond the utterly terrifying, pathological need to inflict maximal violence upon unsuspecting victims. The heavily publicized, sensationalized media coverage surrounding the newly dubbed Torso Killer immediately transformed the bustling, previously indifferent streets of Manhattan into an atmosphere saturated with profound, inescapable dread. Law enforcement was forced to acknowledge that they were entirely outmatched by an adversary operating completely outside the bounds of conventional criminal logic. This horrific event definitively established a terrifying modus operandi that would plague the tri-state area for months, signaling the tragic, undeniable commencement of a brutal campaign of violence that would heavily strain the limits of local, state, and federal investigative resources. As the intense, pressurized investigation expanded over the following frantic months, the sheer geographic scope of the killer's deeply depraved operations rapidly broadened, plunging the authorities into a complex, profoundly frustrating state of cross-jurisdictional confusion between New York and New Jersey. Cottingham continued to execute his terrifyingly brutal methodology, with an incredibly chilling level of discipline, successfully luring multiple victims, including Valerie Street and John Rayner, to various budget motels lining the desolate highways before subjecting them to unimaginable, prolonged sessions of extreme torture and eventual strangulation. The deeply overwhelmed task forces, operating entirely without the massive benefit of modern, integrated computerized databases, severely struggled to connect the brutalized, frequently dismembered bodies discovered in New Jersey back to the horrific, foundational murders that had recently terrified Times Square. It rapidly became glaringly apparent to the deeply experienced behavioral analysts assigned to the incredibly complex case that the killer was actively, methodically collecting highly specific, completely tangible trophies from the devastated crime scenes. The predator was explicitly retaining the victims' identification cards, unique pieces of jewelry, and distinct articles of clothing as morbid keepsakes of his brutal conquests. This macabre, profoundly obsessive hoarding of deeply personal items served as a crucial, psychological anchor for the killer, allowing him to continuously, eternally relive the absolute, terrifying power and unquestioned control he had aggressively exerted during the moments of his unspeakable atrocities. Furthermore, his deeply organized, highly compartmentalized double life allowed him to seamlessly commit these monstrous acts during his routine, mundane commutes, effectively masking his blood-soaked reality behind the entirely impenetrable, ordinary facade of a dedicated husband and a reliable corporate employee. As the terrifying, rapidly increasing body count violently escalated, investigators tirelessly pursued thousands of desperately promising but ultimately useless leads, heavily profiling deeply transient individuals, known violent offenders, and local organized crime figures, while the true monster quietly worked his mundane computer shifts. The absolute, undeniable brutality of the crime scenes deeply horrified even the most hardened, veteran homicide detectives, as they continuously uncovered evidence of severe, organized post-mortem mutilations and increasingly grotesque acts that pointed toward a deeply disordered, sadistic psychological framework. The entire tri-state region was effectively held hostage by this terrifying, entirely faceless terror, a deeply malignant entity who seemed perfectly capable of striking at will and subsequently vanishing directly back into the suffocating urban fog, without leaving a single viable microscopic trace. The mounting, incredibly heavy pressure on the exhausted task forces reached absolutely unprecedented, unsustainable levels, leading the terrified public to legitimately fear that the notorious torso killer would successfully evade capture and permanently fade into the dark, forgotten annals of American true crime history. The agonizing, seemingly insurmountable deadlock of this incredibly expansive, horrific multi-state investigation finally and dramatically shattered during the deeply suspenseful, chaotic early morning hours of May 22, 1980, inside the mundane confines of the Quality Inn in Hasbrouck Heights, New Jersey. In a terrifying, highly aggressive escalation of his profoundly violent compulsions, Cottingham had successfully lured a young, unsuspecting woman named Leslie Ann Odell to the heavily isolated motel room, fully intending to subject her to the identical, catastrophic fate he had forced upon his previous victims. However, in an absolute, deeply miraculous display of sheer survival instinct and overwhelming physical desperation, Odell fought back against her heavily armed attacker with an incredible, ferocious intensity, managing to emit a series of piercing, blood-curdling screams that violently penetrated the thin, cheap walls of the surrounding motel structure. These desperate, highly audible cries for help immediately alerted the deeply vigilant, suspicious motel staff, who instantaneously recognized the undeniable signs of a severe, life-threatening struggle and immediately initiated a frantic, urgent dispatch to the closely stationed local law enforcement agencies. Realizing that his carefully constructed, isolated trap had profoundly, irreversibly failed, a highly panicked, disoriented Cottingham violently abandoned his severely battered victim and desperately attempted a chaotic, frantic escape through the heavily illuminated, exposed corridors of the budget motel. The absolute, breathtaking climax of this sprawling, multi-year manhunt rapidly unfolded in a terrifying, dynamic foot chase across the heavily trafficked motel parking lot, as responding, heavily armed patrol officers aggressively intercepted the fleeing suspect, forcefully subduing him before he could successfully vanish into the dense suburban darkness. The immediate, crucial search of his suspicious, seemingly mundane vehicle and the motel room yielded a terrifying, undeniably horrifying, murder kit that included a massive array of heavy torture devices, reinforced handcuffs, and the disturbing instruments he routinely utilized for his post-mortem dismemberments. More profoundly devastating to his heavily constructed, thoroughly protected facade of absolute normalcy was the subsequent, coordinated police raid on his secret, hidden apartment and his family home. Detectives executing the search warrant uncovered a massive, thoroughly cataloged trove of specific, personal trophies deeply linking him directly to the previously entirely unsolved murders across both state jurisdictions. This dramatic, completely unprecedented capture entirely eradicated the suffocating, pervasive terror that had violently gripped the Treek state area, finally neutralizing a profoundly deranged, incredibly prolific killer who was ultimately caught not by complex forensic magic, but by the sheer courage of a single surviving victim. As the thoroughly bewildered, previously invisible monster was heavily shackled and dragged directly into the sterile, intimidating confines of the police interrogation rooms, the staggering reality of his complete, unvarnished guilt heavily crushed the very final remnants of his entirely shattered double life. The ensuing highly publicized and completely sensationalized trials of Richard Cottingham swiftly evolved into a deeply harrowing, profoundly disturbing descent into the absolute darkest abysses of criminal psychopathy, systematically dismantling every last shred of his entirely fabricated, intensely guarded corporate respectability, confronted with a towering, entirely insurmountable mountain of undeniably horrific physical evidence, specifically the deeply tragic, meticulously hoarded personal trophies he had violently stolen from the murdered women. Juries in both New York and New Jersey rapidly and decisively convicted him of multiple counts of highly aggravated, first-degree murder. The presiding judges, deeply horrified by the sheer, unprecedented savagery of his intensely calculated crimes, immediately sentenced the deeply unrepentant predator to multiple, strictly consecutive life sentences, fundamentally ensuring that he would permanently languish behind the heavily reinforced, unforgiving concrete walls of the state penitentiary system. For several extremely long, profoundly quiet decades, Cottingham remained heavily incarcerated in absolute, total obscurity, stubbornly refusing to fully admit to the true, immensely staggering scope of his horrific, multi-state reign of absolute terror, leaving countless devastated families suspended in a permanent, agonizing state of unresolved grief. However, in a deeply startling, thoroughly unexpected series of events beginning in the late 2000s, the aging, physically deteriorating killer slowly initiated a highly manipulative campaign of confessions, methodically trading detailed, entirely accurate admissions to long, cold murders in exchange for minor, insignificant prison privileges. Over the course of these highly intense, deeply unsettling interviews with seasoned cold case detectives, Cottingham casually and clinically detailed the exact, devastating circumstances of numerous completely unsolved homicides. He officially pushed his verified victim count higher and completely horrified the investigative community by claiming total responsibility for upwards of 100 distinct, highly organized murders. His deeply grotesque, entirely unapologetic legacy serves as a permanent, incredibly grim testament to the catastrophic danger posed by highly organized, compartmentalized predators who brilliantly exploit the absolute societal margins to continuously hoard human lives like disposable, tragic keepsakes. The eventual, heavily delayed resolutions of these deeply tragic cold cases finally provided a small, incredibly hard-fought measure of absolute, definitive closure to the deeply grieving families who had agonizingly waited entire generations for the undeniable truth about their brutally stolen loved ones. As we permanently leave behind the overwhelming, entirely chaotic neon frenzy of the New York metropolitan area and the staggering, absolutely horrific body count of the torso killer, we must immediately pivot our strict investigative focus directly toward the incredibly quiet, seemingly entirely impenetrable heartland of the American Midwest. There, in a deeply trusting, thoroughly peaceful community in Iowa, a shockingly brutal, completely unsolved murder fundamentally destroyed the profound illusion of suburban safety, setting the stage for an agonizing, 4-decade-long mystery centered around a single, highly specific trophy that an entirely different kind of monster took into the freezing, deeply isolated winter night. In the late autumn and early winter of 1979, the tight-knit community of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, represented the quintessential, idyllic heartland of the American Midwest. Characterized by a profound sense of communal trust, quiet suburban neighborhoods, and a rapidly expanding local economy. The city was experiencing a period of modern commercial growth, marked most notably by the recent, highly anticipated grand opening of the sprawling Westdale Mall, a massive retail epicenter that quickly became the primary social and economic hub for the region's youth and families during the bustling holiday season. Amidst this atmosphere of deep-seated security and festive cheer lived 18-year-old Michelle Mary Martinko, a highly popular, exceptionally bright, and deeply beloved senior attending the local Kennedy High School. Michelle was widely recognized by her peers and teachers not only for her striking natural blonde hair and inherent beauty, but also for her above-average academic performance. Her active participation in the school's concert choir and her remarkably kind, outgoing disposition that effortlessly drew people toward her. Her daily existence perfectly mirrored the innocent, optimistic reality of a young woman standing firmly on the precipice of adulthood, deeply embedded in a supportive family structure with her parents, Albert and Janet, who provided a stable, unconditionally loving environment. On the brisk, freezing evening of December 19, 1979, the high school choir hosted a formal celebratory banquet at the nearby Sheraton Inn, an event that Michelle attended wearing a sophisticated black jersey dress, a black scarf, dark pantyhose, and a waist-length white and brown rabbit fur jacket. Following the joyful conclusion of the banquet, Michelle informed her friends of her intention to make a brief, solitary trip to the newly opened Westdale Mall to finalize the purchase of a winter coat that her mother had previously placed on layaway at the J.C. Penney department store. Several acquaintances and classmates distinctly recalled seeing her happily navigating the festively decorated corridors of the mall later that evening, carrying a brown leather purse that contained exactly $186 in cash, projecting an aura of complete normalcy and youthful exuberance. She had parked her family's heavily built, tan 1972 Buick Electra near one of the main commercial entrances, fully expecting to complete her mundane errand and return to the absolute safety of her suburban home before the night grew exceptionally late. Neither Michelle, her deeply trusting parents, nor the broader Cedar Rapids community could have possibly anticipated that this routine, entirely ordinary holiday shopping trip would permanently violently shatter the illusion of Midwestern safety and plunge the city into a devastating, multi-decade nightmare. The deeply comforting illusion of security within Cedar Rapids was violently and irrevocably completely destroyed during the agonizing, freezing early morning hours of December 20, when Michelle's deeply panicked parents officially contacted the local police department to report her highly uncharacteristic, deeply alarming failure to return home. Acting upon the frantic information provided by the family regarding her intended destination, investigating officers immediately dispatched patrol units to visually sweep the massive, heavily darkened, and rapidly emptying parking lots surrounding the perimeter of the Westdale Mall. At approximately 4 a.m, under the stark, unforgiving glow of the municipal streetlights, officers successfully located the family's tan Buick Electra parked in relative isolation, completely setting the stage for a deeply horrific discovery that would permanently haunt the responding law enforcement personnel. Inside the freezing, heavily shadowed interior of the vehicle, police found the brutally lifeless body of Michelle Martinko slumped tragically across the front passenger seat, having been subjected to an overwhelmingly savage, highly personal attack that completely defied any conventional, logical criminal motive. The initial, strictly documented forensic analysis at the crime scene revealed that the young high school senior had been viciously stabbed a staggering 29 times, with the catastrophic, highly lethal wounds heavily concentrated directly upon her face, neck, and upper chest cavity. Furthermore, her heavily bloodied hands bore numerous, incredibly deep defensive lacerations, providing absolute, undeniable physical evidence that she had bravely and fiercely fought back against her heavily armed, entirely unexpected attacker in a desperate, ultimately deeply tragic struggle for her own survival. Most confounding to the deeply experienced homicide detectives who arrived to process the chaotic scene was the absolute, undeniable absence of any traditional, heavily established criminal indicators, as there was zero evidence of sexual assault, and her brown leather purse, containing the significant sum of cash and her personal jewelry, remained completely untouched. The immediate, highly professional elimination of robbery as a viable motive forced the authorities to confront the terrifying, deeply unsettling reality that this was a crime driven entirely by pure, unadulterated psychological rage, executed by a phantom predator who simply wanted to extinguish a vibrant life. The complete lack of a discarded murder weapon and the discovery of distinct, chevron, patterned rubber glove prints on the vehicle's gearshift lever heavily indicated that the killer was highly organized, meticulously prepared, and deeply committed to violently executing his dark, entirely internal compulsions. This horrific, entirely senseless tragedy served as the definitive, undeniable inciting incident that instantaneously transformed Cedar Rapids from a trusting, deeply peaceful enclave into an environment utterly consumed by profound paranoia, effectively launching one of the most exhaustive, heavily scrutinized, and deeply frustrating murder investigations in the entire history of the state of Iowa. Over the intensely frustrating, highly agonizing span of the next 39 years, the investigation into Michelle Martinko's brutal murder evolved into a sprawling, deeply frozen cold case that heavily burdened multiple generations of entirely dedicated, but ultimately completely stymied Cedar Rapids homicide detectives. During the initial, highly chaotic phases of the extensive investigation, law enforcement officers systematically interviewed thousands of local residents, deeply scrutinized the backgrounds of her classmates, and aggressively followed up on countless anonymous tips, ultimately clearing well over 100 potential suspects through traditional alibi verification. As the agonizing decades slowly passed and the original detectives heavily transitioned into retirement, the deeply preserved, strictly cataloged physical evidence, secured from the interior of the BIC Electra sat dormant in highly regulated, deeply refrigerated police storage lockers, silently waiting for the necessary technological advancements to finally expose the invisible phantom. The monumental, entirely highly critical breakthrough in the deeply stagnant case finally materialized in 2005, when a highly meticulous cold case investigator, thoroughly re-examining the original forensic files, successfully submitted the victim's heavily preserved black jersey dress to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigations Laboratory for advanced, highly sensitive DNA extraction. The state laboratory scientists managed to successfully isolate a highly specific, entirely foreign blood stain, officially designated in the deeply complex forensic reports as stain CF5, which yielded a pristine, undeniable partial male genetic profile that conclusively belonged to the individual who had violently murdered the young woman. Despite heavily uploading this pristine, entirely undeniable genetic blueprint into the highly expansive, heavily interconnected National Combined DNA Index System CODIS, the deeply hopeful investigators were met with absolute, profoundly disappointing silence, as the killer possessed no prior felony convictions that would have required his genetic inclusion in the federal database. The investigation remained completely paralyzed until 2018, when the deeply determined task force enlisted the highly specialized, entirely groundbreaking services of Parabon Nanolabs to execute a deeply complex, highly sophisticated genetic genealogy trace utilizing the expansive, completely public DNA databases such as GEDmatch. This highly advanced, entirely revolutionary scientific technique successfully identified a distant familial matrix, ultimately narrowing the massive, previously entirely insurmountable suspect pool directly down to 3 highly specific brothers who had grown up in the deeply quiet, neighboring town of Manchester, Iowa. Law enforcement immediately initiated a massive, highly covert surveillance operation specifically targeting Donald Kenneth and Jerry Lynn Burns, meticulously tracking the deeply ordinary, thoroughly mundane daily routines of the three aging men in a desperate, highly calculated attempt to legally secure discarded, deeply microscopic traces of their genetic material. Following the successful, highly covered collection and subsequent rigorous laboratory analysis of discarded trash items belonging to Donald and Kenneth, both men were permanently, undeniably excluded as the primary contributors to the heavily guarded FF5 DNA profile, leaving the heavily armed, deeply focused authorities staring directly at the absolute, undeniable final remaining suspect. The absolute, breathtaking climax of this incredibly agonizing, 40-year-long search for justice ultimately unfolded not in a dramatic, highly chaotic police shootout, but within the deeply ordinary, thoroughly mundane confines of a deeply unremarkable pizza ranch restaurant situated in Manchester on a quiet October afternoon in 2018. Heavily undercover, entirely deeply focused investigators meticulously tailed 64-year-old Jerry Lynn Burns, an outwardly highly successful, deeply entrenched local business owner who had effortlessly maintained an impenetrable, completely perfect facade of absolute innocence throughout the entirety of his entirely unremarkable, deeply quiet adult life. The highly trained, deeply vigilant detectives discreetly occupied the adjacent dining booth, silently observing as the completely unsuspecting, heavily aging killer calmly consumed his meal and repeatedly drank deeply from his heavily iced soda, using a highly standard, completely clear plastic drinking straw. The precise moment Burns finished his entirely routine lunch, stood up, and casually exited the heavily populated restaurant. The deeply focused investigators immediately swooped in, carefully, highly methodically securing the discarded plastic straw and deeply packaging it as the ultimate, profoundly critical piece of highly coveted biological evidence. The deeply secured, highly guarded item was immediately rushed directly to the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigations laboratory, where highly skilled, deeply meticulous forensic scientists rapidly extracted the microscopic saliva cells and directly compared the resulting genetic sequence against the deeply tragic, highly preserved blood profile extracted from the black dress. The resulting, highly anticipated forensic report delivered an absolute, undeniably staggering mathematical certainty, definitively concluding that the exact probability of discovering this highly specific genetic profile in a completely random population of unrelated individuals was mathematically less than 1 in an astonishing 100 billion. Armed with this completely impenetrable, highly undeniable scientific proof, heavily armed investigators immediately obtained a strict, legally binding search warrant to directly extract a buccal swab from the deeply bewildered, entirely unprepared businessman directly inside the quiet, thoroughly mundane confines of his own local office. When deeply experienced, highly aggressive interrogators directly confronted him with the absolute, undeniably staggering reality of the flawless genetic match, Burns's carefully maintained, entirely lifelong facade of bewildered innocence rapidly began to visibly fracture. Though he stubbornly, repeatedly demanded that the police continue to heavily test the deeply irrefutable evidence. During this highly intense, deeply rigid official interview, the profoundly desperate suspect attempted to thoroughly downplay his incredibly suspicious presence near the immediate geographical vicinity of the mall on the night of the horrific murder. The entirely monumental, deeply historic arrest officially occurred on December 19, 2018, exactly 39 agonizing years to the exact, heavily mourned anniversary day that he had violently, completely senselessly extinguished the immensely bright, highly promising life of the vibrant high school senior in the dark, heavily isolated mall parking lot. The subsequent, highly anticipated, and deeply scrutinized criminal trial of Jerry Lynn Burns officially commenced in February of 2020, serving as a highly emotional, deeply profound culmination of decades of entirely unresolved communal grief and immensely rigorous, highly sophisticated forensic determination. The deeply experienced, highly aggressive defense team attempted to heavily argue that the state investigators had profoundly, inherently violated the defendant's strict constitutional rights by covertly analyzing the DNA heavily attached to the entirely discarded drinking straw completely without securing a prior judicial warrant. However, the presiding judge decisively, completely unequivocally struck down this heavily calculated legal maneuver, officially ruling that an individual fundamentally, completely legally relinquishes any reasonable, legally protected expectation of privacy regarding biological material that is casually, entirely voluntarily abandoned in a highly public, completely unrestricted commercial space. During the deeply intense, highly factual proceedings, the strictly focused prosecution meticulously presented the completely undeniable, towering mountain of genetic evidence, officially confirming beyond any reasonable, heavily debated doubt that the blood deeply embedded within the fabric of Michelle Martinko's dress belonged exclusively to the deeply unrepentant man, sitting quietly at the defense table. Following a deeply meticulous, highly concentrated deliberation period, the deeply attentive jury swiftly and definitively returned an absolute, legally binding verdict of guilty on the profound charge of first-degree murder, completely ensuring that the deeply hidden predator would finally, irreversibly face the ultimate consequences of his horrific, decades-old violence. The highly resolute judge subsequently sentenced Burns to a completely mandatory, strictly unalterable term of life imprisonment securely behind bars, entirely without the remote possibility of parole, permanently isolating the deeply deceptive killer from the very society he had so successfully, heavily manipulated for nearly 4 complete decades. While heavily debated, entirely post-arrest revelations indicated that Burns had deeply engaged in profoundly disturbing, highly specific internet searches involving extreme violence and murder long after the crime. This entirely psychological digital hoarding served merely as a deeply grim, entirely secondary footnote to his incredibly horrific, entirely undeniable physical reality. This completely digital, highly secretive obsession ultimately demonstrated that although the killer lacked a physical, thoroughly tangible souvenir, he actively, deeply utilized modern technology to endlessly sustain the highly perverse psychological memory of his solitary, profoundly violent conquest. The deeply delayed, heavily fought legal resolution finally delivered an incredibly profound, absolute measure of hard-fought closure to the heavily devastated Martinko family and the deeply scarred Cedar Rapids community, fundamentally proving that the unrelenting, highly sophisticated march of forensic science effectively renders the passage of time completely irrelevant to the absolute pursuit of true justice. As we permanently leave the deeply quiet, highly resilient heartland of the American Midwest and the deeply solved tragedy of the Westdale Mall behind, we must immediately pivot our strict investigative focus directly toward the incredibly vast, deeply unforgiving, and heavily isolated frozen expanses of the last frontier. There, a highly organized, entirely nomadic, and profoundly terrifying apex predator was meticulously, actively burying completely horrific, highly specialized kill kits across the vast geographic breadth of the United States, utilizing his highly transient lifestyle to completely evade detection while maintaining a deeply horrific, entirely photographic collection of his devastating, highly calculated atrocities. In the early years of the 21st century, the sprawling, heavily interconnected interstate highway systems of the United States provided an unparalleled mechanism of absolute, unfettered mobility for millions of deeply ordinary, hardworking citizens traversing the vast geographic expanse of the country. Within this massive, deeply transient flow of daily interstate commerce and routine travel, an entirely unremarkable, highly skilled construction contractor named Israel Keyes meticulously cultivated a perfectly camouflaged existence that completely defied the established, traditional parameters of criminal profiling. Residing primarily in the rugged, deeply isolated environment of Alaska, Keyes presented an incredibly flawless, profoundly mundane outward facade as a deeply reliable small business owner, an honorably discharged military veteran, and a quiet, thoroughly dedicated father who seamlessly blended into the deeply pragmatic fabric of his local community. However, beneath this carefully constructed, highly impenetrable veneer of absolute blue-collar respectability existed a profoundly terrifying, utterly devoid psychological void. An apex predator who viewed the entire North American continent strictly as a boundless, heavily resourced hunting ground for his deeply calculated, entirely random atrocities. Unlike the vast majority of heavily studied serial offenders, who frequently operate within deeply established geographic comfort zones or strictly target highly specific demographic victim profiles. Keyes actively, methodically engineered his entire lifestyle to completely neutralize the incredibly advanced, modern tracking methodologies utilized by federal law enforcement. He aggressively financed his deeply horrific, multi-state campaigns of violence by quietly executing highly organized bank robberies, utilizing the heavily untraceable stolen cash to seamlessly fund cross-country flights, completely anonymous rental car acquisitions, and sprawling, deeply erratic road trips completely disconnected from his actual residence. During these highly secretive, entirely untraceable excursions, he utilized his profound, heavily ingrained military discipline and his exceptional backcountry survival skills to completely vanish into the deeply isolated wilderness areas of the contiguous United States, silently preparing for terrifyingly brutal acts of highly premeditated violence. The general public, heavily reliant on the fundamental, completely universal assumption that violent crimes are typically committed by individuals possessing a deeply established connection to the victim or the immediate geographic location, remained entirely, profoundly oblivious to the devastating reality of his highly nomadic threat. The deeply unsettling truth was that a highly organized, entirely invisible phantom was actively, completely meticulously traversing the country, relying precisely on the sheer, terrifying randomness of his violent strikes to effectively render himself completely immune to detection. As he quietly managed his carpentry business and attended entirely mundane community events in Anchorage, he was simultaneously, deeply methodically plotting an incredibly sophisticated, highly devastating abduction that would finally, irreversibly expose his horrifying existence to the deeply overwhelmed federal authorities. The deeply chilling, profoundly terrifying catalyst that completely shattered the absolute, freezing quiet of the Alaskan winter and officially initiated one of the most expansive, highly urgent federal manhunts in modern history occurred on the bitterly cold evening of February 1, 2012. 18-year-old Samantha Koenig, a highly vibrant, entirely deeply beloved local resident, was working a completely routine, solitary shift at the Common Grounds espresso stand, a deeply compact, highly isolated wooden kiosk situated in a heavily darkened parking lot in Anchorage. As the deeply freezing night progressed, a completely unidentifiable, heavily bundled figure suddenly materialized on the deeply grainy, highly crucial security camera footage, initially appearing as an entirely ordinary customer, seeking a completely standard transaction before rapidly, violently escalating the encounter into a profoundly terrifying, highly coordinated abduction. The entirely silent, deeply horrifying surveillance video captured the highly organized assailant forcefully drawing a concealed weapon, deliberately cutting the kiosk's exterior lights to completely plunge the immediate scene into absolute darkness, and aggressively binding the entirely terrified young woman before forcefully extracting her from the deeply vulnerable structure. When the highly alarmed, deeply concerned morning shift arrived to discover the utterly abandoned kiosk, the entirely untouched cash register, and the profoundly disturbing, highly chaotic signs of a sudden, forced departure, a massive, thoroughly urgent missing persons investigation was immediately, forcefully launched by the deeply concerned local authorities. The immediate, highly terrifying realization that this was not a simple, entirely voluntary disappearance but a strictly organized, highly aggressive stranger abduction completely sent a massive, paralyzing shockwave of profound terror rippling through the deeply tight-knit, highly resilient Anchorage community. The incredibly dire, profoundly escalating situation fundamentally transitioned from a localized, deeply frantic search effort into a highly complex, financially motivated hostage crisis when Samantha's deeply devastated family suddenly received a highly disturbing, completely anonymous text message demanding a specific ransom explicitly deposited into the missing victim's personal bank account. This heavily calculated, deeply cynical financial demand immediately provided the deeply frustrated, entirely overwhelmed investigators with a highly critical, fundamentally tangible digital trail, completely transforming the previously stagnant, heavily frozen investigation into a highly dynamic, technologically driven pursuit of a phantom. The immediate, strictly monitored activation of the victim's debit card, revealed a deeply terrifying, highly staggering geographical reality. As the heavily tracked financial transactions began sporadically, violently appearing in geographically disparate locations thousands of miles away across the American Southwest. The entirely bewildered, deeply alarmed law enforcement agencies were forcefully compelled to acknowledge that they were actively hunting an incredibly sophisticated, highly mobile predator who had flawlessly executed a completely clean abduction and subsequently vanished completely off the grid with an utterly terrifying level of absolute, disciplined precision. As the massive, highly coordinated federal task force assumed absolute, complete operational control over the rapidly expanding investigation, the sheer, incredibly terrifying magnitude of the killer's entirely unprecedented, highly sophisticated methodology began to slowly, profoundly materialize before the deeply exhausted, completely astounded FBI behavioral analysts. Investigators meticulously tracking the deeply erratic, highly isolated ATM withdrawals trailing across Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas ultimately uncovered the profound, deeply horrifying concept of the killer's meticulously buried, heavily concealed, kill kits, entirely revolutionizing the FBI's fundamental understanding of extreme, heavily premeditated serial homicide. Years prior to actively executing any specific, highly localized acts of violence, Keyes had actively, deeply methodically traveled across the United States, covertly burying tightly sealed plastic buckets completely filled with highly reliable firearms, industrial zip ties, heavy-duty disposal chemicals, and entirely untraceable cash in deeply remote, heavily forested areas. This incredibly chilling, entirely unparalleled level of absolute premeditation allowed him to seamlessly fly into an entirely random city, secure a completely innocuous rental vehicle, drive hundreds of miles strictly to unearth a deeply hidden kit, and then violently abduct a completely random, entirely unconnected victim without ever transporting highly suspicious, immediately incriminating materials through airport security. Furthermore, the deeply horrifying, strictly internal psychological motivations driving this highly organized predator were fundamentally rooted in a profound, highly sadistic need to actively acquire and meticulously hoard deeply disturbing, purely photographic trophies of his entirely helpless victims. In a deeply grotesque, completely unimaginable display of absolute psychological cruelty entirely designed to successfully extort the heavily monitored ransom funds, Keyes had previously violently murdered Samantha Koenig, meticulously applied theatrical makeup to her deeply frozen corpse, and physically sewed her eyelids open to explicitly stage a highly convincing, utterly terrifying photograph utilizing a current daily newspaper. This entirely macabre, deeply calculated Polaroid was explicitly captured and securely retained by the killer specifically to maintain the highly agonizing, entirely fabricated illusion that the young woman was still completely alive, thereby ensuring the deeply desperate family would continuously fund his highly erratic, heavily cross-country evasion. The incredibly heavily burdened, strictly multi-agency investigation found itself completely paralyzed by the sheer, entirely absolute randomness of his victim selection, as the deeply seasoned federal profilers possessed absolutely zero established psychological links, deeply geographic clusters, or strictly predictable, entirely uniform behavioral patterns to effectively anticipate his profoundly devastating next strike. The entire nation was quietly, deeply unknowingly functioning as a massive, entirely accessible hunting reserve for a profoundly intelligent, completely merciless killer who flawlessly utilized the incredibly vast, entirely anonymous infrastructure of the American highway system to completely erase his highly violent, profoundly devastating physical footprints. Investigators were forced to continuously confront the profoundly horrific reality that the perpetrator treated human lives entirely as expendable, strictly disposable assets required merely to satisfy his deeply ingrained, highly pathological need for complete and absolute domination. The absolutely breathtaking, incredibly suspenseful climax of this sprawling, heavily complex national manhunt ultimately transpired during the highly routine, seemingly entirely mundane early morning hours of March 13, 2012, completely far removed from the heavily frozen, deeply tragic Alaskan landscape where the horrific ordeal had initially violently commenced. A highly vigilant, completely observant Texas Highway Patrol officer, meticulously monitoring the deeply isolated stretches of a rural highway, positioned strictly near the heavily forested town of Lufkin, positively identified a highly specific, slightly speeding white Ford Focus that completely perfectly matched the deeply guarded, heavily prioritized suspect vehicle description explicitly associated with the highly tracked ATM withdrawals. The ensuing, highly tense, strictly procedural traffic stop was executed with absolute, perfectly disciplined caution, resulting in the immediately successful, completely non-violent apprehension of the entirely unremarkable, deeply stoic Israel Keys, definitively terminating the incredibly dangerous, highly mobile flight of the most profoundly terrifying serial predator operating within modern American history. A subsequent, deeply exhaustive, entirely meticulous forensic search of his highly ordinary rental vehicle yielded a completely undeniable, strictly horrifying cache of entirely incriminating physical evidence, including the deeply sought after debit card explicitly belonging to Samantha Koenig, incredibly realistic theatrical disguises, and the heavily concealed, completely undeniable weapons actively utilized in his horrific, highly organized abductions. Following his immediate, heavily secured extradition directly back to the entirely freezing, deeply shocked city of Anchorage, Keyes was immediately placed into the completely sterile, highly intimidating confines of a federal interrogation room, where he casually, deeply unnervingly engaged with the highly experienced, completely focused FBI behavioral analysts over a series of intensely rigid, strictly prolonged interviews. Over several deeply agonizing, entirely highly calculated months, Keyes fundamentally utilized his completely undeniable, highly detailed knowledge of his thoroughly hidden atrocities strictly as psychological currency, deeply coldly and clinically trading completely unvarnished, highly horrifying facts about his heavily concealed victims in explicit exchange for specific, strictly temporary accommodations such as premium cigars and particular coffee beverages. During these incredibly disturbing, completely highly transactional sessions, the fully unmasked predator completely lacked any discernible human remorse, casually detailing the deeply tragic, entirely brutal murders of Bill and Lorraine Currier in Vermont, and deeply boasting about his extensive, completely hidden photographic archive of his deeply horrific, heavily orchestrated massacres. The highly experienced, completely hardened federal agents were forced to sit strictly across from a profoundly arrogant, thoroughly broken psychological entity who completely explicitly utilized his deeply terrible memories and highly secured digital trophies as a permanent, utterly unassailable fortress of absolute, dominating power over the deeply grieving, entirely devastated families he had irreparably destroyed. This deeply protracted psychological warfare explicitly demonstrated his profound, entirely unyielding desire to rigidly maintain ultimate control over the horrifying narrative of his own deeply devastating, completely unconscionable acts of extreme brutality. Ultimately, the federal task force recognized that they were heavily negotiating directly with a profoundly hollow, entirely unredeemable entity, whose sole remaining purpose was to completely manipulate the deeply established frameworks of the federal judicial system. The deeply complex, entirely highly protracted legal resolution of the Israel Keyes investigation was violently, permanently abruptly short-circuited on the completely quiet, highly heavily guarded morning of December 2012, strictly preventing the highly desperate federal authorities from ever completely uncovering the absolute, entirely staggering total scope of his deeply horrific, multi-state atrocities. Left completely alone within his strictly monitored, deeply isolated holding cell at the highly secure Anchorage Correctional Complex, the profoundly calculating, completely unrepentant predator successfully executed a highly deliberate, flawlessly planned suicide, utilizing a completely undetected, secretly hoarded razor blade and a tightly fashioned, deeply rudimentary strangulation device to permanently extinguish his own profoundly toxic existence. He explicitly, entirely unapologetically left behind a deeply blood-soaked, highly heavily encrypted suicide note heavily consisting of deeply disturbing, highly narcissistic poetry that fundamentally offered an absolute, completely terrifying ode to extreme violence, but provided strictly zero, entirely deeply necessary names, explicit locations, or highly tangible answers regarding the deeply numerous, completely unknown victims still heavily missing. The massive, deeply dedicated FBI task force was ultimately left intensely grappling with a profoundly terrifying, heavily incomplete timeline, explicitly establishing a completely firm, highly verified belief that Keyes was absolutely, undeniably responsible for a minimum of 11 deeply horrific murders, while heavily harboring the profound, terrifying certainty that his completely actual victim count could be significantly, substantially higher. The deeply horrifying, entirely enduring physical legacy of Israel Keyes firmly heavily resides in the profound, explicitly terrifying realization that multiple deeply buried, completely perfectly preserved, kill kits still strictly heavily remain entirely undiscovered, silently rotting entirely within the deeply isolated, heavily forested wilderness expanses of the contiguous United States, completely patiently waiting for a monster who will permanently never return. His absolutely horrific, deeply heavily calculated rampage permanently altered the fundamental, deeply established operational protocols of federal missing persons investigations, strictly completely shattering the deeply held, completely fundamental illusion that violent, highly organized serial predation is strictly confined to explicitly localized, heavily thoroughly predictable geographic boundaries. As we firmly, completely immediately leave behind the vastly expansive, heavily frozen wilderness of the North American continent, and the profoundly deeply terrifying, heavily mobile threat of Israel Keyes, we must strictly pivot our deep investigative focus, directly backward in time, and entirely across the globe to the profoundly rigid, deeply strictly controlled environment of the 1970s Soviet Union. There operating entirely completely underneath an incredibly heavy, absolute veneer of state, sponsored trust and highly esteemed public prestige, a highly decorated pioneer camp director named Anatoly Slivko was actively, deeply methodically cultivating an entirely different, incredibly gruesome, strictly purely photographic and physical collection of unspeakable, deeply devastating horrors perpetrated completely entirely against the most deeply vulnerable members of his highly trusting society. The profoundly shocking, completely devastating reality of this ensuing case fundamentally dismantled the highly strictly enforced, deeply propagandized illusion that such entirely horrific, highly pathological violence was an exclusive, deeply endemic product of Western capitalist decay. We must now deeply, strictly prepare to descend into the incredibly suffocating, highly entirely bureaucratic shadows of the Soviet state, where an absolutely deeply trusted mentor utilized his highly esteemed, completely unquestioned authority to orchestrate a terrifying, highly documented reign of absolute tragedy. In the deeply rigid, heavily controlled environment of the Soviet Union during the 1970s and 1980s, the industrial city of Novosibirsk functioned strictly as a quintessential representation of the highly prioritized socialist collective, where absolute trust in state institutions was profoundly, fundamentally mandated by the ruling regime. Within this intensely structured society, the official narrative completely dictated that violent, highly pathological crimes were an exclusive, deeply degenerate symptom of Western capitalist decay, rendering the very concept of a domestic serial predator theoretically impossible in the eyes of the deeply entrenched state bureaucracy. Operating entirely within this profound, highly protective ideological blind spot was Anatoly Slivko, an individual who outwardly represented the absolute, completely flawless embodiment of the ideal Soviet citizen, a highly decorated veteran, a devoted Communist Party member, and a widely celebrated honored teacher of the Russian SFSR. He successfully founded and deeply authoritatively directed the Shurjit Pioneer Tourist Club, a highly prestigious, state-sponsored organization that explicitly offered young boys rigorous wilderness training, advanced survival skills, and a highly coveted, strictly guaranteed pathway towards successful military careers. Parents across the entire region practically begged to have their vulnerable sons admitted to the highly exclusive ranks of the club, viewing Slivko not merely as an ordinary instructor, but as a profoundly respected, surrogate father figure explicitly endorsed by the highest, most unquestioned levels of the communist state apparatus. This absolute, completely pervasive societal reverence and his strictly appointed bureaucratic authority provided an entirely impenetrable, highly effective shield of absolute respectability that flawlessly masked his profoundly dark, deeply psychopathic reality. Slivko meticulously cultivated this highly pristine public persona, explicitly utilizing his immense, state-sponsored power to completely secure entirely unmonitored, highly isolated access to the most deeply vulnerable, and entirely trusting demographic within the entire industrial region. Behind the heavily locked doors of his strictly restricted club facilities, and during the deeply isolated wilderness expeditions he constantly organized, the ideal Soviet mentor harbored entirely horrific, deeply pathological sadistic compulsions that completely defied the highly sanitized, heavily propagandized narrative of the communist utopia. The entire trusting community, deeply conditioned from birth to absolutely revere the party and its strictly appointed educators, remained profoundly, tragically oblivious to the deeply terrifying reality that they were willfully handing their children directly over to a meticulously organized, completely unrestrained apex predator. The absolute, strictly ideological trust placed in Slivko by the vast state machinery inadvertently created a perfectly insulated, highly secretive hunting ground where a monster could operate for decades with deeply terrifying, completely unchecked impunity. The heavily fortified, completely manufactured illusion of absolute safety within the Nevenomyssk region began to slowly, tragically erode as a highly disturbing, completely uncharacteristic pattern of young pioneer boys vanishing without a single trace started to silently plague the tightly knit industrial community. The terrifying reality of these deeply agonizing disappearances was severely compounded by the profoundly entrenched, highly ideological reluctance of the Soviet militia to officially acknowledge the very existence of organized, highly repetitive murder occurring within their strictly controlled borders. When frantic, deeply devastated parents desperately attempted to report their heavily missing sons, local authorities frequently dismissed their highly legitimate concerns with profound, heavily bureaucratic apathy, officially attributing the tragic, entirely sudden absences to highly improbable runaway scenarios or completely random, strictly localized drowning accidents near the heavily flowing Cuban River. This profound, highly systemic denial effectively served as a massive, entirely impenetrable protective barrier for Slivko, allowing his early, deeply horrific crimes to completely bypass any serious, highly coordinated investigative scrutiny from the strictly regional law enforcement apparatus. The definitive turning point that absolutely should have violently awakened the deeply compromised authorities occurred when profoundly unsettling rumors regarding Slivko's incredibly harsh, highly unorthodox and extremely dangerous survival experiments began to quietly, deeply fearfully circulate among the heavily terrified children of the Pioneer Club. However, the deeply ingrained cultural mandates strictly forbidding any formal, highly invasive questioning of a highly decorated party member, an esteemed state educator, ensured that these crucial, highly alarming whispers were completely ignored, severely downplayed, or actively suppressed by the deeply rigid, fundamentally flawed bureaucratic hierarchy. This devastating combination of absolute state denial and Slivko's completely unassailable public reputation fundamentally established a terrifying, highly permissive environment where the deeply organized predator could actively refine his strictly grotesque methodology, completely devoid of any immediate, highly tangible threat of legal exposure. The authorities had essentially, completely unwittingly handed a prolific, highly sadistic serial killer a completely blank check to continue his deeply horrific campaign, strictly prioritizing the fragile, heavily manufactured illusion of Soviet societal perfection over the desperate, highly legitimate cries of the deeply grieving families. The deeply isolated, highly vulnerable boys were effectively completely abandoned by the very state apparatus fundamentally designed to heavily protect them, leaving them entirely at the mercy of a profoundly deranged individual who weaponized the revered pioneer uniform as a deeply terrifying instrument of absolute control. The absolute failure of the state to strictly acknowledge the existence of the threat completely enabled the predator to deeply entrench his highly horrific, purely pathological methodology over the ensuing, deeply tragic decades. Over the profoundly agonizing, entirely unimpeded span of more than 2 decades, Slivko meticulously orchestrated a horrific, highly systematic campaign of severe abuse and strictly premeditated murder, completely transforming his widely celebrated Pioneer Club into a deeply secretive, entirely impenetrable chamber of horrors. Operating entirely under the heavily fabricated, utterly deceptive guise of conducting highly specialized, strictly exclusive medical and advanced survival experiments, he methodically isolated specific, deeply vulnerable boys, coercing them into actively participating in deeply terrifying scenarios involving staged executions and prolonged, highly dangerous asphyxiation. His deeply pathological methodology was uniquely horrifying, as he fundamentally utilized his absolute, state-sanctioned authority to completely bypass the natural, heavily ingrained defensive instincts of his victims, forcing the highly trusting children to willingly submit to being tightly bound and heavily suspended by the neck, until they entirely lost consciousness. While many of the heavily traumatized children were subjected to these deeply terrifying, highly dangerous, revival experiments and eventually allowed to live, Slivko inevitably crossed the absolute definitive threshold into systemic, highly organized murder, completely extinguishing the lives of at least 7 young boys in the profoundly dark, heavily isolated wilderness of the region. Most terrifyingly, Slivko was not merely a ruthless murderer but a deeply obsessive, highly meticulous archivist of his own profound depravity, actively utilizing a state-issued AIM film camera to strictly, heavily record every single agonizing moment of his horrific, highly calculated atrocities. He actively, deeply methodically built an entirely secret, comprehensively cataloged cinematic library of his brutal executions, transforming his deeply tragic victims into permanent, highly tangible visual trophies that he could endlessly, systematically review within the dark, completely isolated confines of his heavily locked private office. Furthermore, he exhibited a highly specific, deeply disturbing fetishistic compulsion to explicitly collect the physical footwear of his victims, meticulously cleaning and permanently storing the completely unremarkable shoes and heavy boots of the murdered children as deeply personal, highly significant physical anchors to his brutal, highly organized conquests. The sheer, deeply staggering longevity of his completely undetected, highly documented crime spree fundamentally exposed the catastrophic, deeply fatal vulnerabilities inherent within the highly rigid, strictly monitored Soviet surveillance state, a massive system completely designed to track political dissidents but utterly, totally blind to the actions of a highly respected, deeply monstrous insider. While the deeply devastated, completely ignored families mourned in absolute silence, Slivko continued to routinely receive highly prestigious state awards and extremely public commendations, completely masking his blood-soaked reality behind a towering, utterly impenetrable fortress of manufactured, highly guarded bureaucratic prestige. The state machinery fundamentally served as his greatest, entirely unwitting accomplice, strictly ensuring his horrifying collection of physical and cinematic trophies remained completely undisturbed in the deeply shadowed corners of the pioneer establishment. The agonizing, incredibly protracted reign of terror fundamentally began to entirely collapse in the summer of 1985 following the deeply tragic, highly alarming disappearance of 13-year-old Sergei Pavlov, a young boy whose sudden absence finally, irrevocably pierced the deeply entrenched, highly willful blindness of the regional authorities. Unlike the previous deeply ignored missing persons cases, highly observant witnesses definitively and strictly placed Sergei in the immediate, entirely exclusive company of the highly esteemed camp director entirely shortly before the boy completely vanished, providing a deeply experienced, newly appointed local investigator named Issa Kostoyev with a highly tangible, completely undeniable thread to aggressively pull. Braving the massive, entirely terrifying risk of profound political retaliation and professional destruction for actively investigating a highly decorated member of the Communist Party, Kostoyev meticulously bypassed the standard, deeply compromised local bureaucratic channels, quietly securing absolute, strictly undeniable authorization to conduct a highly secretive, thoroughly exhaustive search of Slivko's deeply protected home and private Pioneer Club facilities. The absolute, deeply breathtaking climax of the decades-long mystery rapidly unfolded as highly focused, Entirely shocked investigators violently breached the locked, heavily fortified doors of Slivko's deeply isolated club office, instantly uncovering a massive, thoroughly horrifying cache of completely undeniable, explicitly damning physical and highly preserved photographic evidence. Hidden entirely within deeply concealed, highly secured floor compartments, the profoundly horrified detectives discovered Slivko's completely meticulously maintained, entirely grotesque diaries that explicitly, highly clinically detailed the precise, devastating dates and heavily horrific mechanics of every single one of his strictly orchestrated experiments. Surrounding these deeply damning written confessions was his heavily protected, entirely secret archive of Abenum film reels, strictly containing the completely unvarnished, purely horrific visual records of the brutal executions, effectively transforming the deeply respected educator into the undeniable, completely meticulous director of his own profoundly dark, deeply devastating atrocities. Accompanying the deeply traumatic, highly cataloged film library was the completely undeniable, highly terrifying physical collection of meticulously preserved victims' shoes, deeply confirming the absolute, strictly horrifying reality that the widely revered mentor was actively, methodically hoarding the tragic, completely tangible remnants of the heavily missing children. When completely confronted with his own deeply undeniable, highly explicit visual evidence within the highly sterile, strictly controlled confines of the Soviet interrogation room, Slivko's heavily maintained, entirely lifetime facade of absolute, unquestioned communist superiority immediately, violently shattered completely into entirely unrecoverable pieces. The highly respected, deeply decorated predator rapidly devolved into a profoundly pathetic, thoroughly broken entity, coldly and clinically confessing to the entire, deeply staggering scope of his completely horrific, highly organized multi-decade rampage against the most trusting members of the socialist state. The undeniable reality of the horrifying trophies firmly secured his absolute demise, entirely eradicating the deeply held illusion that the state's most trusted individuals were inherently incapable of profound, entirely unspeakable evil. The entirely subsequent, deeply highly secretive legal proceedings against Anatoly Slivko were strictly executed with the absolute, entirely ruthless efficiency completely characteristic of the Soviet judicial apparatus, a deeply rigid system entirely determined to permanently eradicate the profoundly embarrassing, highly catastrophic political anomaly from the historical record. The heavily closed door tribunal fundamentally completely bypassed any deeply complex, highly dramatic psychiatric evaluations or drawn-out legal maneuvering, focusing strictly upon the absolute, completely insurmountable mountain of heavily preserved, highly undeniable cinematic and physical evidence completely secured from his deeply dark, highly isolated pioneer office. The profoundly horrified judges rapidly and entirely definitively convicted the deeply unrepentant predator of multiple counts of highly aggravated, strictly premeditated murder, completely stripping him of all his highly esteemed, previously deeply protected state honors and fundamentally, irreversibly sentencing him to the absolute, strictly mandated penalty of death. In completely late 1989, Anatoly Slivko was strictly unceremoniously executed via a single, highly decisive gunshot to the back of the head strictly within the deep, completely isolated confines of a highly secure Novocherkassk prison facility, permanently extinguishing the profoundly dark, entirely irredeemable existence of the completely unmasked monster. The sheer, entirely staggering revelation of his completely horrific, highly organized crimes profoundly shook the absolute, deeply foundational trust of the Soviet citizenry, fundamentally permanently shattering the highly propagandized, deeply manufactured illusion that the strictly controlled socialist society was completely, entirely immune to the presence of profoundly violent, highly pathological serial predators. The meticulously hoarded shoes and the highly terrifying, strictly preserved film reels were deeply cataloged as purely physical, undeniably horrific testaments to the absolute, completely catastrophic dangers of entirely unchecked, blindly trusted state authority, definitively proving that monsters can flawlessly operate completely within the highest, most respected echelons of a heavily regimented society. The completely devastated, previously entirely silenced families were finally granted the immensely tragic, highly profound reality of their stolen children, completely forced to navigate a deeply permanent, entirely agonizing landscape of unresolvable grief. His deeply horrific legacy serves as a permanent, incredibly grim historical marker, strictly demonstrating that a predator's most profoundly devastating weapon is frequently the absolute, heavily blind trust placed in him by the highly rigid institutions, strictly designed to protect the most deeply vulnerable. As we permanently leave behind the deeply suffocating, highly strictly controlled bureaucratic shadows of the fallen Soviet state, and the terrifying reality of the pioneer camp director, we must strictly, entirely abruptly pivot our deep investigative focus completely backward through the fog of time to the deeply squalid, heavily gas-lit streets of 1888 Victorian London. There, lurking completely entirely within the desperate, deeply impoverished margins of the Whitechapel district, the most completely infamous, highly enduring phantom in the entire history of modern criminology was violently, strictly systematically extracting completely horrific, deeply internal physical trophies from the utterly helpless victims of the autumnal terror. In the waning years of the 19th century, the sprawling, fog-choked labyrinth of London's East End, specifically the deeply impoverished district of Whitechapel, stood in stark, profoundly shameful contrast to the glittering, immense wealth of the broader Victorian Empire. This profoundly neglected urban abyss was a suffocating, deeply squalid nexus of towering tenements, unregulated slaughterhouses, and completely unlit, winding alleyways that harbored hundreds of thousands of desperately impoverished citizens engaged in a daily, brutal struggle for absolute survival. The heavily polluted atmosphere, perpetually thick with a noxious blend of coal smoke and dense river fog, served as a highly oppressive, entirely literal shroud over a population completely abandoned by the social reforms and economic prosperity enjoyed by the city's elite. At the very lowest, most vulnerable stratum of this fiercely unforgiving societal hierarchy were the women commonly referred to by the authorities as the unfortunates, deeply marginalized individuals fundamentally forced into desperate survival sex work, merely to secure the meager fourpence required for a heavily crowded, filthy dosshouse bed. These incredibly vulnerable women navigated the dangerous, heavily shadowed street corners deeply intoxicated by cheap gin, a desperate, entirely necessary psychological anesthetic utilized to briefly escape the crushing, highly traumatic reality of their grinding poverty and profound societal invisibility. The local metropolitan police, heavily underfunded and deeply overwhelmed by the sheer, staggering volume of routine poverty-driven crime, maintained a highly visible but completely ineffective presence, fundamentally unable to actively protect a deeply transient demographic that the Victorian establishment actively chose to ignore. This deeply fractured, highly desperate environment entirely eliminated the need for a predator to utilize sophisticated charm or complex, highly coordinated abduction techniques, as the extreme economic desperation of the victims inherently forced them to willingly walk directly into the darkest, most isolated corners of the slum with complete strangers. The absolute, undeniable misery of Whitechapel inadvertently created the most perfect, heavily completely camouflaged hunting ground in modern criminal history, a place where blood deeply stained the cobblestones on a nightly basis and screams for help were entirely, deeply routinely ignored by the deeply desensitized local populace. It was entirely within this deeply forgotten, highly toxic crucible of human suffering that a completely unprecedented, profoundly terrifying apex predator was meticulously preparing to entirely redefine the fundamental parameters of serial homicide, entirely transforming the squalid alleyways into an internationally scrutinized theater of absolute, unparalleled butchery. The profoundly trusting, deeply desperate women of the East End were entirely, tragically unaware that the shadows they sought for meager commerce were about to completely consume them, setting the highly tragic stage for a phantom who would literally carve his horrific legacy directly into the annals of history. The deeply ingrained, miserable status quo of Whitechapel was violently, irrevocably shattered in the freezing, pre-dawn hours of August 31st, 1888, following the horrific, completely unprecedented discovery of Mary Ann Nichols strictly within the heavily darkened, completely isolated confines of Bucks Row. Responding patrolmen, completely accustomed to routinely discovering heavily intoxicated or fiercely beaten individuals in the sprawling gutters, were profoundly, deeply horrified to discover that Nichols had been subjected to a highly methodical, entirely savage level of violence that completely defied standard criminal categorization. Her throat had been brutally, entirely severed directly down to the spine with an incredibly sharp, heavily bladed instrument, and her abdomen had been viciously, deeply mutilated in a highly specific manner that immediately indicated a profound, terrifyingly calm level of post-mortem interaction. This initial, entirely gruesome discovery served as the definitive, deeply horrifying inciting incident that instantly catapulted the local, deeply overwhelmed police force into an absolute, unprecedented state of high alert, fundamentally forcing them to heavily acknowledge that a profoundly abnormal, highly dangerous predator was actively stalking the district. The previously localized, highly ignored street violence of the East End suddenly, violently coalesced into a deeply specific, highly targeted campaign of terror as local authorities frantically realized the perpetrator possessed a deeply chilling, highly efficient methodology completely unlike the chaotic, drunken brawls typical of the era. As the incredibly sensationalist, highly aggressive Victorian press heavily caught wind of the deeply horrific details, they aggressively flooded the deeply terrified streets, broadly publishing wildly graphic, heavily exaggerated accounts that instantly ignited a massive, entirely unprecedented firestorm of public panic and profound paranoia. The terrified realization that a silent, entirely invisible monster was actively butchering the most helpless, deeply marginalized women right under the noses of the heavily patrolling police sent absolute, paralyzing shockwaves entirely throughout the highest, most secure echelons of the British government. Investigators immediately, desperately scrambled to establish a highly coherent profile, entirely lacking the modern forensic tools, centralized databases, or basic crime scene preservation protocols strictly necessary to effectively combat a highly organized, completely mobile, and profoundly disciplined phantom. The absolute turning point had officially, entirely tragically been crossed. The City of London fundamentally realized it was no longer merely policing a deeply impoverished slum, but was actively, desperately hunting an entirely different breed of human monster, who struck with terrifying silence and vanished completely without a single microscopic trace. This brutal, entirely undeniable commencement of the canonical murders officially plunged the vast metropolis into an absolute, highly prolonged era of paralyzing fear, fundamentally setting a deeply terrifying precedent that would intensely frustrate the greatest investigative minds of the 19th century. Over the deeply agonizing, utterly frantic span of the following months, the massive investigation completely plunged into a desperate, highly chaotic labyrinth as the incredibly elusive killer violently escalated his deeply horrifying activities, brutally murdering Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, and Catherine Eddowes with chilling, entirely unstoppable precision. The absolute, profoundly terrifying peak of the public panic officially materialized during the deeply infamous double event of September 30, when the completely unyielding predator successfully executed two separate, highly brutal murders entirely within the exact same night, effortlessly evading thousands of heavily armed police officers and deeply terrified civilian vigilance committees. It was during these heavily analyzed, strictly documented subsequent autopsies that the deeply experienced police surgeons made a completely horrifying, fundamentally paradigm-shifting realization regarding the killer's ultimate, profoundly dark motivation. The perpetrator was explicitly, highly methodically extracting completely specific human organs from the severely mutilated bodies. The killer had successfully, entirely surgically removed the uterus of Annie Chapman and a kidney from Catherine Eddowes in the complete, pitch black darkness of the deeply exposed streets, retaining these deeply horrific, highly visceral biological components as the ultimate, profoundly grotesque physical trophies of his absolute, terrifying triumphs. This absolutely chilling, deeply medical precision heavily indicated that the Phantom possessed a highly advanced, strictly anatomical knowledge, completely shifting the frantic investigative focus directly toward the deeply respected medical community, local butchers, and highly trained surgeons operating entirely within the sprawling city limits. The immense, completely unprecedented pressure on Scotland Yard reached highly critical, absolutely breaking points as the massive investigative dragnet repeatedly completely failed to produce a single, highly viable suspect, heavily hampered by the intensely restrictive, deeply blinding physical reality of the ubiquitous London fog. Furthermore, the deeply overwhelmed police force was heavily inundated with thousands of deeply manipulative, entirely highly taunting letters supposedly authored directly by the killer, including the deeply infamous "Dear Boss" missive that permanently, officially coined the terrifying moniker, Jack the Ripper, and the utterly terrifying, "From Hell" letter that actually physically contained half of Catherine Eddowes' heavily preserved, surgically extracted kidney. This highly specific, completely undeniable physical proof completely shattered the heavily demoralized investigators, fundamentally forcing them to confront the profoundly horrifying reality that the killer was actively, deeply maliciously mocking their utter incompetence, while literally consuming or permanently hoarding the biological trophies he had stolen in the night. The entire Victorian establishment was effectively, entirely completely held hostage by a deeply invisible, highly organized terror, an entity who seemed absolutely, perfectly capable of striking entirely at will and immediately dissolving directly back into the suffocating urban smog, leaving behind absolutely nothing but deeply devastated bodies and a profoundly shattered, heavily panicked public consciousness. The profound failure of the authorities to strictly contain the violent escalation fundamentally highlighted the immense, catastrophic vulnerabilities of entirely conventional police tactics when violently confronted with a strictly highly organized, psychologically driven serial predator fundamentally seeking highly tangible, deeply personal physical keepsakes. The absolute, breathtaking climax of this unparalleled historical nightmare materialized not in the damp, heavily exposed alleyways of the East End, but completely within the highly private, profoundly claustrophobic, and completely secured confines of a small, heavily impoverished room entirely located at 13 Miller's Court on the deeply freezing morning of November 9, 1888. Having successfully lured a young, deeply desperate 25-year-old Irish woman named Mary Jane Kelly completely directly into her own private residence, the profoundly organized predator was finally, absolutely afforded the one critical, entirely deeply highly coveted element he had previously lacked during his incredibly rushed outdoor attacks, completely unrestricted, entirely unmonitored time. When a deeply unsuspecting rent collector peered strictly through a heavily broken windowpane later, that deeply traumatic morning, he immediately discovered a completely unimaginable, profoundly horrifying tableau of absolute, unprecedented carnage that completely broke the deeply hardened psychological resolve of the highly experienced responding police surgeons and deeply seasoned homicide inspectors. Inside the heavily blood-soaked, entirely confined room, the predator had completely, entirely methodically dismantled the victim's body over the course of several agonizing hours, strictly stripping her flesh directly from the bone, completely obliterating her facial features to render her entirely unrecognizable, and deliberately, highly ritualistically draping her internal organs around the deeply horrific, heavily saturated crime scene. This absolute, completely entirely unrestrained crescendo of extreme violence represented the profoundly terrifying, ultimate peak of his highly pathological compulsions, functioning not merely as a murder, but as a deeply complete, highly meticulous anatomical deconstruction, explicitly designed to entirely satisfy his profoundly dark, deeply unquenchable internal psychological urges. However, deeply buried entirely within this absolute, completely overwhelming chaos of horrific destruction lay the final, most profoundly chilling reality of his highly specific, deeply ritualistic trophy hunting. Amidst the meticulously placed internal viscera, heavily scattered around the destroyed bed, Mary Jane Kelly's heart was completely, entirely missing from the utterly devastated, highly secured room. The killer had deliberately, strictly extracted the ultimate, most profoundly symbolic human organ, and entirely successfully carried it away into the deep, completely highly impenetrable Victorian fog, a highly horrific, completely final act of absolute, undisputed dominance over the desperately terrified, deeply paralyzed city. Immediately following this utterly catastrophic, deeply historically unmatched explosion of absolute savagery, the canonical murders permanently, highly mysteriously, and completely inexplicably ceased, completely halting the sprawling reign of terror exactly at its most violently terrifying, deeply profoundly disturbing zenith without a single, highly tangible explanation. The deeply overwhelmed investigators were completely left standing strictly amidst the sheer, profoundly deeply unimaginable ruins of Miller's Court, entirely fundamentally lacking a single, completely viable suspect, staring directly into an absolute, entirely profound investigative void that permanently sealed the deeply horrifying reality of the Ripper's unpunished escape. The deeply agonizing, totally unresolved aftermath of the Whitechapel murders left an indelible, profoundly permanent, completely unforgettable scar entirely across the collective, deeply traumatized psyche of the global law enforcement community, strictly cementing Jack the Ripper as the ultimate, completely unassailable archetype of the highly successful, entirely deeply elusive serial predator. Despite the massive, thoroughly unprecedented deployment of absolutely every strictly available investigative resource, completely entirely deeply encompassing highly expansive door-to-door interrogations, the rigorous tracking of highly suspicious, deeply transient individuals, and the strict, completely unprecedented consultation of highly early psychological behavioral profiling, the true identity of the surgical monster was never definitively, legally established. The profoundly terrifying phantom simply, entirely completely evaporated back out into the deep, highly impenetrable mists of history, leaving heavily deeply debated theories suggesting he completely succumbed to a fatal disease, was strictly secretly entirely institutionalized within a deeply remote, heavily guarded asylum, or successfully deeply migrated across the absolute, entirely vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. His profoundly dark, completely horrific legacy fundamentally forced a massive, completely entire total revolution strictly within the rigid, deeply foundational practices of modern policing, directly permanently catalyzing the highly urgent, completely deeply necessary advancement of highly strict crime scene preservation, highly sophisticated post-mortem forensic photography, and deeply coordinated, highly analytical cross-jurisdictional detective methodologies. The deeply specific, profoundly personal biological trophies he entirely successfully extracted and heavily permanently hoarded. The highly missing organs completely stolen directly from the deeply tragic, entirely helpless victims, were never deeply definitively recovered, remaining permanently lost entirely to the deep, highly silent obscurity of the passage of time. The deeply marginalized, completely forgotten women of the East End, completely fundamentally forced the entire world to strictly deeply heavily acknowledge the profound, absolutely terrifying existence of highly deeply organized, entirely profoundly psychologically driven killers who actively deeply, meticulously hunt solely for the complete, entirely pure gratification of violent, highly absolute destruction. As we permanently completely firmly leave behind the deeply foggy, entirely completely gas-lit streets of 1888 Victorian London and the profound, deeply entirely enduring mystery of the world's most infamous unidentified phantom, we must immediately deeply completely pivot our strict investigative focus directly forward into the completely modern, highly deeply digital era. There, situated completely entirely within the deeply close-knit, highly deeply trusting environment of a completely modern Georgia law school, a profoundly deeply different type of deeply organized predator was meticulously, completely actively constructing a massive, highly deeply entirely terrifying digital and physical archive, strictly demonstrating that the deeply horrifying compulsion to entirely stalk and collect deeply personal trophies has only entirely completely evolved alongside modern technology. In the early summer of 2011, the historic, deeply insulated academic community surrounding the Mercer University Walter F. George School of Law in Macon, Georgia, represented an environment fundamentally defined by intense intellectual rigor, profound collegiate camaraderie, and the highly anticipated promise of bright, successful legal futures. At the absolute center of this vibrant, deeply supportive collegiate atmosphere was 27-year-old Lauren Giddings, an exceptionally brilliant, highly popular recent law school graduate who possessed an incredibly warm, deeply magnetic personality that effortlessly drew peers and faculty alike into her expansive social orbit. Originally from Maryland, Lauren was actively, deeply enthusiastically preparing for the grueling Georgia bar exam. Residing in the Barristers Hall apartment complex directly adjacent to the prestigious university campus, maintaining a highly disciplined, completely ordinary routine strictly focused upon her impending professional legal career. Her daily existence was characterized by profound optimism, deep community engagement, and a completely unwavering trust in the fundamental safety of her immediate, highly educated surroundings, entirely unaware that this deeply ingrained collegiate trust was actively being exploited by a profoundly disturbed individual living literally right next door. Stephen McDaniel, a fellow law student and immediate neighbor, presented a stark, deeply unsettling contrast to Lauren's vibrant energy. He was a highly intelligent but profoundly socially isolated, deeply awkward individual who harbored intense, heavily concealed psychological obsessions completely masked by his quiet, unassuming academic facade. While the broader law school community actively celebrated their recent graduations and collaboratively prepared for their legal examinations, McDaniel was actively, deeply methodically cultivating a profoundly dark, entirely terrifying digital and physical obsession with the brilliant young woman living on the other side of his apartment wall. He actively weaponized his highly advanced intellect and his completely invisible, deeply mundane presence within the apartment complex to systematically monitor her every movement, transforming the deeply safe, highly familiar environment of her private residence into a highly compromised, strictly surveyed hunting ground. The devastating, entirely unavoidable collision between her vibrant, completely unsuspecting reality and his profoundly dark, highly pathological obsession was silently accelerating, strictly hidden entirely behind the quiet, completely unassuming brick facades of the law school housing. As the sweltering Georgia heat descended upon the deeply quiet campus in late June, the previously entirely impenetrable illusion of absolute collegiate safety was meticulously being dismantled by a highly organized predator who utilized modern technology and highly calculated proximity to completely erase the deeply established boundaries of personal privacy. The incredibly tight-knit, deeply trusting community remained entirely, profoundly oblivious to the terrifying reality that one of their own highly educated peers was actively preparing to execute a profoundly devastating, entirely unconscionable act of extreme violence, driven completely by a deeply toxic, entirely unrequited obsession. The deeply comforting, completely fabricated illusion of absolute security within the Mercer legal community was violently, irrevocably shattered in the final, deeply agonizing days of June 2011 when Lauren's highly uncharacteristic, entirely alarming failure to communicate with her tightly knit circle of friends officially triggered a massive, entirely unprecedented localized crisis. Recognizing that the deeply responsible, highly communicative young woman would completely never voluntarily sever all contact, especially on the immediate eve of a highly critical professional examination, her frantic, deeply concerned classmates initiated an urgent, highly desperate intervention, physically breaching the locked door of her Barristers Hall apartment in a frantic search for answers. Upon entering the deeply quiet, entirely undisturbed residence, her friends were immediately confronted with a profoundly terrifying, highly alarming tableau. While Lauren was entirely missing, all of her crucial, deeply necessary personal belongings, strictly including her keys, her wallet, and her highly active cellular phone, remained completely, entirely abandoned within the heavily locked structure. This highly critical, completely undeniable absence of basic survival items fundamentally eradicated any lingering, highly hopeful theories of a sudden, voluntary departure, instantly forcing the heavily alarmed local authorities to immediately elevate the deeply concerning situation from a standard missing persons inquiry directly into a highly prioritized, entirely critical criminal investigation. As the Macon Police Department aggressively deployed massive, heavily coordinated search grids entirely across the sprawling campus and the immediate surrounding city blocks, the deeply terrifying reality of her sudden vanishing sent a massive, paralyzing shockwave of of profound fear rippling completely through the deeply insulated, highly educated student body. The previously deeply quiet, entirely strictly academic corridors of the law school were violently transformed into a highly chaotic, heavily scrutinized epicenter of absolute communal panic, as heavily armed officers meticulously processed the deeply compromised apartment complex and desperately interviewed completely terrified neighbors. The intense, highly pressurized investigation rapidly attracted massive, entirely overwhelming attention from the local and national media establishments, who aggressively descended upon the deeply traumatized campus, broadcasting the highly tragic, completely unresolved mystery directly into living rooms across the entire country. The absolute, completely terrifying turning point officially materialized when heavily specialized law enforcement teams, meticulously searching the immediate exterior perimeter of the Barristers Hall complex, made a profoundly horrific, entirely unimaginably gruesome discovery hidden completely within the heavily enclosed, strictly communal trash receptacles. The recovery of Lauren's severely dismembered torso fundamentally confirmed the absolute, entirely most deeply suppressed fears of the entire community, definitively proving that a profoundly violent, highly organized predator was actively operating strictly within the deeply intimate confines of their own highly trusted, heavily insulated academic sanctuary. This incredibly brutal, completely undeniable discovery served as the terrifying catalyst that instantly propelled the desperate investigators completely into a highly dynamic, technologically driven pursuit of a phantom who had successfully executed a completely horrific atrocity right under their very noses. As the highly intensive, strictly multi-agency investigation frantically expanded, the deeply exhausted detectives completely unexpectedly received their most profoundly critical, entirely undeniably crucial investigative breakthrough strictly courtesy of a highly bizarre, completely publicly broadcast television interview conducted directly outside the heavily cordoned crime scene. During a highly routine, seemingly entirely mundane local news broadcast, Stephen McDaniel, completely presenting himself as a deeply concerned, entirely highly cooperative neighbor, willingly engaged with a television reporter, delivering a profoundly unsettling, highly erratic performance characterized by deeply extreme physical sweating, entirely bizarre emotional affectations, and a completely rigidly unnatural vocal delivery. The absolute, deeply terrifying moment of profound psychological rupture occurred completely on live television when the deeply unsuspecting reporter casually informed the heavily perspiring law student that a dismembered body had just been officially recovered from the complex's trash bins, completely causing McDaniel to visibly, dramatically collapse into a highly performative, deeply entirely unconvincing state of absolute shock. This deeply highly abnormal, strictly widely circulated televised reaction immediately, completely violently catapulted the deeply quiet, highly socially isolated student directly to the absolute, strictly highest priority position strictly at the very top of the heavily extensive suspect matrix maintained by the deeply seasoned homicide detectives. Armed with this highly profound, completely undeniable behavioral red flag, heavily armed investigators immediately executed a strictly comprehensive, highly invasive search warrant upon McDaniel's adjacent apartment, completely uncovering a massive, deeply terrifying digital and physical archive that fundamentally exposed the incredibly dark, completely highly pathological depths of his entire obsession. The forensic technicians, meticulously processing his heavily cluttered residence, discovered completely undeniable, highly terrifying physical evidence, specifically including completely unauthorized master keys to the entire apartment complex, deeply highly incriminating packaging for a specifically purchased hacksaw, and a profoundly horrific, heavily cataloged cache of deep internet searches, specifically detailing the exact, highly anatomical mechanics of human dismemberment. Most profoundly chilling to the deeply hardened, entirely highly experienced behavioral analysts was the absolute, completely undeniable discovery that McDaniel was actively, deeply methodically functioning as a highly organized stalker, having secretly, strictly illegally filmed Lauren through her completely compromised second-story window using a deeply highly specialized camera mounted strictly upon a completely elongated pole. Furthermore, The deeply meticulous, entirely rigorous search completely revealed that McDaniel had actively, deeply repeatedly breached her entirely locked apartment completely prior to the horrific murder, specifically explicitly stealing deeply personal, entirely intimate articles of her clothing, strictly permanently retaining these highly specific items as deeply terrifying physical trophies of his absolutely invisible, entirely dominating control over her heavily surveilled existence. The deeply horrifying reality entirely crystallized before the completely profoundly astounded investigators. The highly educated, deeply unassuming neighbor had meticulously, entirely utilized his highly advanced legal intellect and deeply profound technological proficiency entirely to construct a massive, deeply perfectly preserved monument to his highly toxic, completely deadly obsession. The entire, highly complex investigation completely fundamentally shifted from a completely deeply desperate search for an unknown phantom strictly into a highly methodical, entirely surgical dismantling of a highly arrogant, profoundly psychopathic mind completely trapped within its own deeply cataloged digital footprint. The absolutely breathtaking, incredibly suspenseful climax of this sprawling, heavily complex investigation fundamentally unfolded completely entirely within the deeply sterile, highly claustrophobic, and strictly monitored confines of the Macon Police Department's primary interrogation room. When strictly confronted by highly experienced, completely relentless homicide detectives, McDaniel immediately deployed a profoundly bizarre, highly disturbing defensive strategy, consciously entirely deliberately locking his physical body into a completely rigid, absolutely motionless posture that he strictly maintained for completely deeply agonizing, highly unbroken hours. Sitting completely perfectly still, staring entirely blankly directly ahead with profoundly unblinking, utterly dead eyes, he responded to absolutely every single highly pointed, deeply aggressive question with a completely robotic, entirely monotone repetition of the phrase, "I don't know," completely deeply attempting to entirely psychologically outlast the heavily frustrated, entirely determined investigators. However, his deeply arrogant, completely fundamental belief that his highly advanced legal education and completely rigid physical discipline would entirely successfully protect him from highly severe legal prosecution was profoundly, entirely violently shattered by the absolute, strictly insurmountable mountain of heavily undeniable digital and physical evidence. The highly seasoned detectives completely methodically, strictly systematically dismantled his profoundly constructed psychological fortress, entirely explicitly presenting him directly with the deeply terrifying videos he had secretly recorded of his victim. The absolutely undeniable forensic evidence deeply linking the purchased hacksaw directly to the horrific crime scene, and the deeply horrifying internet search history that permanently, entirely completely mapped out his strictly premeditated murder plan. The completely absolute, strictly devastating death blow to his entirely fabricated facade officially materialized when the entirely relentless investigators explicitly directly confronted him entirely with the deeply highly specific physical trophies he had so deeply, completely obsessively hoarded, definitively fundamentally proving that he had entirely strictly invaded her most profoundly highly private sanctuary. As the sheer, completely crushing weight of the entirely undeniable, completely technologically preserved reality finally, entirely pierced his profoundly arrogant delusions of absolute superiority, McDaniel's completely rigidly maintained, entirely highly unnatural physical posture slowly, deeply entirely began to completely violently collapse. The highly terrifying, deeply invisible monster who had completely utilized the absolute, strictly anonymous shadows of the internet and the profoundly structural vulnerabilities of the apartment complex was finally, absolutely dragged directly into the highly unforgiving, completely heavily illuminated light of absolute justice. The highly exhausting, deeply completely profound psychological battle of absolute wills permanently, entirely officially ended with the completely arrogant law student entirely profoundly realizing that he had completely meticulously built the exact, strictly perfectly constructed digital cage that would entirely absolutely hold him for the completely absolute rest of his entirely miserable life. In a completely desperate, strictly profoundly calculated attempt to entirely avoid the deeply highly likely imposition of the completely absolute legal death penalty. Stephen McDaniel completely officially formally pleaded strictly guilty to the deeply aggravated first-degree murder of Lauren Giddings in entirely early 2014. As a completely absolute, strictly mandatory condition of his heavily negotiated plea agreement, he was fundamentally entirely forced to strictly explicitly provide a completely detailed, deeply undeniably written confession, clinically strictly detailing the profoundly horrific mechanics of his entirely premeditated, completely deeply savage attack. The presiding judge, completely profoundly horrified by the sheer, entirely unprecedented level of strictly absolute technological stalking and completely utterly ruthless violence, immediately entirely sentenced the deeply unrepentant predator directly to an absolute, strictly mandatory term of life imprisonment, entirely ensuring that his highly dangerous intellect would permanently entirely rot behind heavily, strictly reinforced concrete walls. The completely devastating loss of Lauren Giddings permanently, entirely absolutely altered the fundamental, strictly psychological fabric of the highly Mercer Law School community, completely fundamentally destroying the deeply held, completely absolute illusion that highly advanced education completely insulates an environment from completely deeply profound, entirely pathological evil, the specific, highly deeply intimate trophies he had so deeply obsessively stolen and entirely heavily hoarded were completely strictly cataloged as completely undeniably profound, entirely horrifying testaments to the absolute, strictly fundamental, completely devastating danger of entirely unmonitored digital stalking. His completely absolute, deeply profound legacy serves entirely as a completely perfectly dark, entirely absolute modern warning that the absolute, completely entirely horrifying compulsion to meticulously track and entirely physically hoard deeply personal remnants of entirely innocent lives is fundamentally completely not strictly confined to the deeply heavily dusty, entirely ancient annals of completely absolute history. As we completely formally step away from the completely absolutely devastated, entirely shattered academic community of entirely Georgia, and the entirely highly absolute completely terrifying reality of the stalking law student, we must finally, entirely strictly turn our absolute, entirely deeply focused collective attention completely directly toward the completely highly absolute fundamental sweeping summary of this deeply completely horrifying journey. It is entirely strictly absolutely imperative that we now completely strictly pause to entirely deeply profoundly reflect completely upon the completely highly absolute strictly unvarnished, entirely deeply completely cold reality of the completely highly devastating evidence absolutely strictly left entirely fundamentally behind by these deeply completely absolutely entirely dark, entirely profoundly empty minds. These 10 predators shared a chilling compulsion, not merely to extinguish human lives, but to hoard their physical fragments as permanent monuments to absolute cruelty. As we officially seal the vault on their macabre collections, one profoundly terrifying question remains: how many unrecognized, stolen trophies currently sit quietly on the shelves of perfectly ordinary homes right next door? Thank you for watching, and remember to always look closely at the shadows around you.